Well, ladies and gentlemen, I had so much fun speaking with Alex Ebert last time, and I think freak theory is incredibly useful in getting at something incredibly important. So I'm thrilled to have a chance to speak with him again. So, Alex Ebert, what you been thinking about? Where are you at right now? And thank you for being here, sir.
Actually, one thing does come to mind. I was thinking about belonging again to part one.
Yes, yes, yes.
I love how you keep sneaking in these decimal points. Yeah, I haven't read it yet. It just came out, but and I haven't even had a chance to review much of it. However, when I was discussing freak theory last night with Cadel, um, I was describing, in particular, the relational saturations, which constitute these super freaks or sublations or whatever we want to, call them, these moments of indeterminacy, which relate to the automaticity of interiority. And I think that this is the big thing I want to, every couple of months I get on a kick where I feel like I have to keep repeating, and I'm repeating it in my own mind for your benefit, the proverbial you, but really I'm also repeating it for my own benefit because I'm sharpening the rhetoric and I'm looking in the eyeballs and I'm seeing if any of it's landing. As an aside, hopefully my brain will be able to come back to belonging again. It will. Interiors. I'm going to put a pin in that. As an aside, what I find interesting that I'm even talking about freak theory with you right now. So freak theory, I began developing it about 6 years ago. I began mapping it and schematizing it 4 years ago. And then I began sort of like cautiously and sometimes very incautiously sharing it and sort of trying to explain it to people and seeing if it would register. And for some people, especially you, and Greg Enrique a bit, but see, I didn't know that. Mainly it was you were the one who seemed to pick it up right away. You were like, yeah, I understand this. You're like, I can map this. Okay, this is a good a thought prop or something.
Sure.
Anyway, so I'm banging on about that, getting in massive arguments with people who will be unnamed about it, and meanwhile still developing it. And then eventually it's not that I'm moving on, but I started developing very, very specific semantical reference with regard to the very my minutia of operations that would produce a super freak, or the minutia of rhetoric that would be consistent throughout the dialectical process, and so on. And so for a time, I wouldn't even really reference the word freak theory. I would just talk about these saturations and relational saturations and what occurs then. And I started developing and talk a lot about interiority and exteriority, and talk a lot about automaticity and problematicity, which is my most recent development, and so on. In some part, to just avoid argumentation. I think when you present a theory where you're like, this is the name of my theory, motherfucker, then all of a sudden people are like, okay, buddy, slow your roll. Yeah. They want to suddenly start attacking from all sides. You give it a name and suddenly it has a boundary zone and it's got its own interior, and people are like, let me attack that object, but if you keep it without a name for as long as possible, it can sort of remain amorphous and just sort of be parts of a parcel as opposed to the parcel itself. So kind of sneak under the radar. So I wanted to do that because I was getting tired of arguing, and also I didn't feel prepared yet to really promote what some people might perceive to be a TOE. It has that sort of theory of everything sort of quality to it. And I realized I just wasn't prepped yet for that. You know what I mean? So anyway, ironically, with what's happened in the last couple months, after a lull of like almost 2.5 years of never hearing anyone else bring it up, you'd mention it, that was it. All of a sudden, just all of these people start. I was mentioning Greg Henrique. He was like, oh, and is this like freak theory? You know, I use that model a lot in my thinking and blah blah blah. I was like, really? Because when I brought it up ages ago, it didn't seem, or whatever. And like Cadel was like, hey, what about freak theory? And then all these people on the IDW list like just start referencing apropos of not me, just apropos of their own thinking. And they're like, well, this reminds me of freQ. I'm like, where did you even find freak theory? Like, what did you do? You went on YouTube and scoured the internet for me giving a couple random ramshackle explanations of freQ? Wow. How did it end up seeping? Not to the extent that I'm having a conversation with you, just in some modest way, right? So I'm actually delighted that to just watch that process, however small that process is. God knows it hasn't hit some sort of like, you know, threshold point of cultural saturation or anything, but just within our tiny circles of community, it seems to, I've seemed to have watched it sort of take a random hold, and that's been actually quite delightful to see, because God knows I haven't actually ever departed from it. It still represents the visualization of the dialectic as I see it. But more than that, within that visualization, there are a number of things that I think are rather novel contributions to the dialectic, namely creating an equivalency between non-dynamism and phenomenological absence. I think that's really crucial. And then creating a visualization of the collapse of relational dynamics, where you can see that the collapse of relational dynamics entails an interiority that itself is boundaried. And those two things, interiority vis-a-vis the collapse of relational dynamics, and that collapse, by the way, is always an occurrence, in my view, almost always an occurrence of saturated relational dynamics. So saturation and collapse. And then, of course, that interiority, in effect, creates the subject, the interiority of the subject, which itself is boundaried and thereby creates exteriority for the subject. And through that process, you get the necessity of I wouldn't say necessity, but you get phenomenology. You get the reason for phenomenology, and so that's where I'm sort of coming from. And to bring it all back to belonging again, so I was talking to Cadel, and I was like, okay, so you have these, you know, these collapse, these saturations of relation, which themselves, by the way, I don't know if you saw this on the news just yesterday. I think it was reported that a once in a fucking billion year, like, biological acquisition took place. Scientists discover a once in a lifetime year event, two life forms merging to create a new cell part. Yeah, so it's engulfed, a microbe that was engulfed by an algal cell 100 million years ago has since evolved into an integral part of the cell's machinery. Anyway, so new interiorities, and of course we experience this on a, like, you know, it's once in a billion years, biologically speaking, but we experience this all the time phenomenologically. I mean, it's one of the best parts about being alive, is feeling like you're belonging, right? And that's where we started, you know, I started being like, yes, you belong, and you create an interiority. Then there's a self-relating negativity where you're like, whoa, I got to leave this interiority because I see an exterior that I want to make into a new interiority. And so you engage with the dialectic again, which creates, which is dialectic, of course, between differential relations as opposed to self-same relationality. And so you engage in differential relation against a backdrop of supposed negativity, right? So you're in the external world, you're in the world of objects, you are one of the objects as subject. And then all of a sudden you feel like at a certain threshold, boom, you're on this interior again. In fact, I was describing, and then Cadel was like, dare I say belonging again? And it was, I was like, oh yeah, I'm actually now extra curious to read this next chapter of, well, I should say many chapters of part 2 of Belonging Again, under that sort of context. There was an example. So anyone watching probably knows you host this thing called the Net, and let's see what we can catch, so on. And you host well, a host of characters who tend to show up weekly, bit of a revolving door. And it's been going on for how long? A year?
About 2 years, yeah.
A year.
Yeah.
So 2 years. Now, the frequency is weekly. So it's a bit of a, theoretically, a periodic waveform. Now, periodic waveforms don't exist in nature, because that would produce an interminable, spurious infinity under the conditions under which would never produce a qualitative change. In other words, immortal. It would produce something immortal, an immortal waveform, and those don't exist. So, in theory, a weekly hosting on the internet is periodic, classically periodic, but it is existing in real life, even though it's on the web. Now, how is that going to undergo a qualitative change if it's periodic? If it's periodic, then it should theoretically only repeat, because there is no limit that we can see against which the periodicity would run up against and then have to repeat itself against until there was a collapse of relationality that produced a qualitative shift under the conditions of indeterminacy, so that on the other side of that indeterminate limit, a newness emerges. Now, where would that limit be? It's not like you set up the net to be, it's going to be weekly at first, then it's going to be daily, then it's going to be hourly, then minutely, then momently, and all of a sudden we're going to have this incredible saturation of relation. And on the other side of that really intense crucible of saturation, we're going to emerge different. You didn't have that. You just had periodicity. And yet, there was a threshold, or there is a threshold that I experienced about 3 weeks ago. I joined the conversation late, about an hour in. It ended up going about 3-4 hours. And everyone during that conversation kept remarking during the conversation, holy shit, this is a good conversation. Whoa, this is a good conversation. I can't believe this conversation. Everyone was suddenly in this, like, there was a qualitative shift. Now, what that means is that a threshold was crossed. What that means is that there was a limit that was revealed beyond which a qualitative shift occurred, even though the net meets periodically. And there is no visible limit. There's no explicit limit. There was a relationality that was developed between the characters who tend to show up that eventually saturated, that eventually exceeded a quantitative threshold. And again, the idea of a quantitative threshold is really important, right? Again, think of the mantra, apple, apple, nothing's happening. Guru, what am I doing wrong? Keep going. Apple, apple, apple. What the fuck is this? Nothing's happening. Keep going. Apple, 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 apple. All of a sudden, there is a revealed threshold beyond which a qualitative shift emerges. And somehow on the net, I experienced that. And I was like, whoa. Now, Peter Limberg, who runs the Stoa, was hollering at me about something, and I'm not going to divulge too much because it's a private conversation, but he was like, you know, I want to do a project like this. And he was just describing a project, not a project like yours, project that he wants to do. That, and he described in basic terms the desire for musicality, for a jam, and that something was going to happen intellectually that people could feel on a visceral level that was similar to musicians jamming at a really high level. And what I brought him back to, or what I pointed him at, was my experience with the net. Is that if you're always having new relation come in to the fold, and every week you're hosting a new guest, there is not going to be a chance for relational saturation or relational buildup to occur. In order for the quantitative threshold to be revealed, the relationality has to be redundant. Because it's through the very repetition of redundancy that eventually a saturation point can occur beyond which a qualitative relational occurrence emerges. And that's the amazing secret to the persistence of relationships.
Outstanding. Everything you said was extremely good. And in fact, for me, the very spread and like you were describing at the beginning with freak theory, that in of itself as a kind of meta move is a testament to freak theory, where you had to have this saturation point and then it appears, everyone had to go through and then it the very way that information travels follows freak theory. And one of the reasons to me the theory is so important is because I'm always interested, like the opening book, and thank you for your references of belonging again to one, and I do like to sneak in decimal points, is in fact this question of how does anyone leave Plato's cave on their own? And the reason why this question is so big is because I am of the opinion that we have not really thought it, and it has political ramifications, economic ramifications for everything. But of course, there's a bit of a paradox or quandary here, because how would anyone leave Plato's cave on their own? By definition, you don't know there's an outside. You're looking at the shadows like you're stuck in it, right? Freak theory is the schema that provides the possibility of it, because there are limits in the cave, okay? You don't have to have a Rousseauian state of nature. You don't have to have a free market. You don't have to have a government. We know you have limit. And we know that that experience can be presuppositionless, as we were saying last time. So to reference on that. So that philosophy that you're putting forth, schema, I'll just call it the freak theory, is precisely the schema that would be necessary for dealing with the problem that, to me, that problem is what is symbolic of belonging again. Because for most of history, belonging has been basically geographical consistency. Like you stay in the same location, you don't really go anywhere. And this can actually kind of follow the net that you're saying, and I'll get into this. But the problem is it is also susceptible to the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt talks about, the closed-mindedness and the sort of problems that we see. But then on the flip side, having no repetition at all or no grounding also leads to a spurious infinity in political problems, right? So belonging, again, as a title, is referring to a few things. First, it's examining in part one previous or current efforts to belong again that don't central around something like freak theory, so they're pathological and don't work. They're leading to unintended consequences. We talk about Dugan, Japan, etc. And so to belong again, it has to be in terms of something that is going to actually honestly follow a freak theory schema. That's going to follow something Hegelian, because what you described with the net is quite critical, where there is a certain, it's not so much newness that you have to have a repetition that people are like, oh, but it's repetition will die. No, actually, that is the only possibility for the appearance of this very critical threshold that is crossed. That is where, when people talk about belonging, that's actually what they are looking for, in a sense. That's really what they want. But the problem is, for most of history, and this would have to get me into Durkheim, Weber, all the sociologists, for most of history, belonging has been a term that has been associated, again, with consistency of location. Like you're in the same town. This is where you belong. You're with your religion. You're with your people. And you see what created that, going into Philip Reeve, is givens. Like it is given. This is your background. You don't even have to think about it, right? Modernity makes you realize, to put it very generally, that you could have just as easily been born Hindu as you were Jewish or Christian. So then all your givens are suddenly visual. You realize that they're just assumptions, and in becoming visual, they enter your frame. They lose that phenomenon effect, as we are saying, and now you're thinking about it, right? And what have you said so many times? That's exactly right. The brain is in the business of moving things into the unconscious. We don't want to think about crap. Well, crap, modernity now made us think about our very backgrounds, our very givens, which is then existentially overwhelming. And when people are like that, they tend to be vulnerable to manipulation, strongmen, fascists, et cetera, so forth, right? And so, the idea, there's been a few theories. It's like, well, let's just, get rid of the idea of belonging entirely. But the problem is that's the idea of newness. You have to have a regularity to get the certain threshold, right? So you've had classically the strategy of roots at the expense of distance, per se, depth at the expense of distance. But then the strategy was like, well, we know that depth can lead to fascism or various forms. So let's just try pure distance, newness. But that's not going to give you the belonging either. The belonging emerges from a structure like you were describing with the net, or also talk about the hip hop cipher. And what's critical, philosophy and political philosophy and economic philosophy and sociological philosophy, they have been far too concerned with things like isness versus encounter. And I've actually, after our last conversation, I've kind of been thinking a lot about almost something like encounterology or maybe surpriseology, because when you talk about freak theory, there's this critical moment of the surprise, the saturation moment, this moment. And philosophy has generally been located in isness or things, as opposed to these moments where a limit appears, where something occurs. And really what we're talking about now is a kind of philosophy interested more so not to create new terms, it's just kind of a way I've been hanging my hat on a kind of encounterology, that moment when beauty appears, that moment when you hit a limit, that moment when you hit a saturation point, and then it's gone just as quickly, or there's a quality and it kind of goes. That kind of thing is what philosophy should be entirely in the business of, just about, because that's what we've not thought, and we're still trying to design societies or politics or economics in terms of stable states, as opposed to the moment of encounter and making that foundational, and then basing anything like regularity or event or surprise on the quality of that encounter or the possibility of that encounter, which always has something to do with hitting a limit. Because if you think a limit, that's not the same as encountering the limit. And so that all said, what's very interesting about all this is that what we're seeing at the net, or the musicology, seems to occur where you have enough people who are regularly meeting at a regular time that they're able to saturate, to use your language, the knowing one another. Oh, I know what this person's going to say. I know what this person's going to say. I have a general idea. Okay, they're going to bring in story. Okay, they're going to bring in Deleuze. And what happens, here's what happens. You think that that's going to reach a place where you're bored, because you're like, well, we just know what everyone's going to say. And you do have times that go slower than not. But actually what can occur is people begin able to speak and make sense without finishing their sentences, or they're able to make connections that they otherwise couldn't make. And a new quality of thinking emerges because of that regularity, that then the things create a new interiority that is not possible if you're not willing to risk boredom or getting old. The irony is most people are always adding new guests, new topics, or things like that, that as a result, you actually don't get that musicality precisely because you're doing what you think is going to give you the musicality, which is the kind of irony, right? And so the other key to the net, and then I'll give it back to you, because to me, this issue that you're describing is why freak theory. So again, for me, freak theory as a schema is the only schema I know of that has the possibility of leaving Plato's cave on its own, of which is necessary for a belonging that is not falling into belonging that is pathological like we've seen, and is found in the movement of the wave per se. It is found in the dance, really. And you're able to actually have regularity. And the thing is about regularity like that is like every week, there's no preset topic at the net. You have no idea what you're going to say, which one is kind of terrifying, because who knows what we're going to say? And what if we run out of things to say? And who knows is going to be there? And what if two people show up that don't like each other and there's some sort of conflict? Those are the kind of risks that are actually necessary with the regularity. And what a way people, I think, happens is they're curating to keep that sort of thing from occurring. But then on the flip side, they may just allow anybody in without doing any sort of work to make sure there's any kind of possibility of relating. Like you have to have enough possibility of relating where it's not randomness or people don't understand what they're saying or people like you can't bring someone in who gets offended easily, right? Because that's immediately going to destroy what's going on. But you also have to have some sort of unknown that is part of the regularity that then when it works out, that quality appears. That quality that you're describing is to me everything about the question of belonging again. Because to take it further, and then I'll give it back to you, that is being incredibly intentional about that in education, in economics. Like that's how you create demand, not just stimulate demand. This is the great problem we have. Like economics right now is falling into the great stagnation. Capitalism is becoming, is getting low growth, like Tyler Cohn talks about, because we talk about the human and organization, not in terms of an encounterology, but in terms of a efficiency. How do we increase efficiency, right? Ironically, that gives you an economy that begins to create wealth inequality, assets go up at the expense of wages and all these other things. But if instead, because you talk about suboptimal, but if instead they say, no, how do we create organizations where we actually don't know exactly what will occur, which is quote unquote suboptimal, but you are being very efficient in the regularity of the suboptimalness per se. That's the trick. You're being very efficient in doing it again or reading or working on your own work to have something to bring to the space that is designed in a kind of inefficient way because you don't have a preset topic and drama can happen. But that mixture of being efficient about the space for the suboptimal is what creates the possibility of that quality that then feels negentropic, if you will, the creation of order out of it's like what? And that's actually where you get your ideas that make new inventions, new possibility of organization. And the problem is in terms of, say, business philosophy or politics, we've not thought that moment, that glimmer, that encounter. And thus we have a doctrine of efficiency and trying to create magic that ironically destroys the possibility of magic. So for me, freak theory kind of as a schema is at the center of these new institutional, economic, political possibilities.
Yeah, when you bring up the cave and the question of, how does one get out of the cave? And then you apply freak theory to it. It's like, well, it's quite simple. You just become bored of being in the cave. You're in the cave too long, and eventually you're like, "What the fuck? I need to leave." In other words, the experience self-saturates,
Yep.
and eventually you've had too much. There is a limit again to limitation, which produces. There's a limit to the unlimited. I should say, there's a limit to unlimitedness. And the experience of sameness and perfect redundancy and actual repetition, of course, is phenomenologically redundant and thereby indeterminate because one experience is indistinguishable from the other. And that indeterminacy itself feels sort of, well, in its indeterminacy, infinite. It has an eternalization with relation to time. And yet, that limitlessness, that sensation of limitlessness, which comes about and arises through indeterminacy and perfect repetition or seeming repetition from moment to moment, that indeterminacy itself is limited. That indeterminacy itself has a quantitative threshold beyond which a determinate experience is going to happen. In other words, you're going to wake up from it. That's why, I mean, we all experience this in our daily lives. In fact, one of the places I experience this most is in conversations like this. You get in a role, you get in a flow, you're in the flow, it reaches this apex, you don't even know that you're in the conversation, you're just so engrossed, and then all of a sudden you're like, I guess the conversation is about to be over. I'm suddenly now realizing that I'm on a podcast, and I'm realizing that time is passing, and I'm realizing I'm getting hungry, and so on and so forth. And I realize it's wrapping up. And we have these experiences, rather constantly. I wanted to say, though, and this is a bit of a fresh thought, so it may come out of
my favorite. I like those.
Okay. With regard to getting out of the cave and the notion of determinacy versus non-determinism, it seems like the application of free will, which I was just thinking about this morning because I was listening to a podcast criticizing Sapolsky, is a bit of a category error, because already, if indeterminacy is not non-determinacy, then I don't know what non-determinacy is. So indeterminacy is already the fundamental crucible through which the dialectical process, which yields agential creatures, occurs. In other words, the very dialectical process which produces creatures of agency is constantly passing through relational collapses of indeterminacy, this encounteringism. It's self-encountering an indeterminate point or moment through which it emerges again in determinate form. So it's a bit of a category error if we're going to talk in any way that is not phenomenological about free will. The very experience of being in a cave and 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 eventually being like, shit, I'm hungry, or having that moment, that threshold moment surpassed, beyond which the excess product is your curiosity about the outside, is already happening. There is no problem to how to get out of the cave. We just get out of the cave. And it's almost a letdown to realize that the processes which we would like to presume are so problematic and must be really devoutly considered and then solved with novelty are actually self-efficiently operating under the hood. And that the real quest of philosophy is simply to reveal the sublime operations that are already taking place. There's something that I think is interesting to, and this is another bit. So you have the collapse of relationality phenomenologically that creates the interiority of belonging. So I'm part of this group. I'm in the interior now. And yes, we begin communicating almost telepathically, and we can finish each other's sentences. And there's this new qualitative experience to the relationships within the boundaries of this interior. Now, every time I say that there is then a self-relating negativity, and then you must embark on a new dialectic and then belong again, I don't necessarily mean that the differential objects previous to the consolidation of relationality that form an interior now redisperse into, like, sort of re-atomize into individualistic little clumps that then create new interiors with other individualistic clumps, maybe the same ones that they formed the prior interiority with. That's not necessarily the case, although of course that happens. What also happens is that the very interiority that is established by belonging creates itself, its own boundary, its own membrane, its own limitation, which from the exterior of that internal saturation produces an object which can then interact dynamically with the rest of exteriority, with other objects. So even though the interiority is non-dynamical, and by non-dynamical, usually we think, well, that sounds really bad. And even my brain breaks when I have to equate non-dynamism with potentiality. And indeterminism, the indeterminate state with non-dynamism, with potentiality, with belonging. But when you are truly relationally collapsed with someone, there is an erasure of the dynamism between you and them. So we just have to let the brain break and accept that there is a certain kind of non-dynamism that phenomenologically occurs relationally between you and another in order for the collapse of belonging. But what's amazing is that now, as a sublated interior, you can act cohesively and unified now with the external world. So a good example is a band, right? You work and you work and you work and you repeat and you repeat and you jam and you jam and you jam and jam, and suddenly you have an interior and you're communicating telepathically. And then the element of surprise that you're constantly introducing is the new environment, the new audience, with which you interact as a unified interior in the exteriority of the world of objects. So that the new dynamism that occurs is not necessarily a return to atomized individuals now interacting again, alone, and then belonging again, but that the very interiority of belonging is interacting in an individualist manner with the rest of the world now. And that's an incredible feeling, to be on a dialectical journey of development with an interior that extends beyond your self, to be growing as a group, to be growing as a couple, to be growing as friends, and so on, growing as a city-state even. But I think that the problem of scale, then, I don't mean to get into politics right away, but I think the problem of scale, you get beyond a sort of, I think we can go far beyond Dunbar's cap, but I think that a problem of scale emerges beyond which the potential for a cohesive, unitary interior of belonging is eroded under the weight of conformity. So there is a certain scale beyond which belonging is essentially erroneous, and the only formation of belonging is engendered under the force of both oppression and self-suppression. So anyway, but that aside, there are ways to develop dialectically as an interiority with the rest of the world. And I just want to say that that interiority of collapsed relation, again, indeterminate and non-dynamical, sort of, like non-dynamical phenomenologically, where it's like, okay, yes, I'm in dynamism with you, but I am also sort of part of you. We've been merged. So there is sort of a formative non-dynamism there, is also equal or equivalent to, represents potentiality. So these interiors are constantly, like, almost sort of like, I don't know if the word susceptible is correct, but avail themselves to transformations at a higher level, because as a group, they are sort of constantly in an indeterminate state, so that you never know what the excess product is going to be. And again, the interior saturation, which describes the state of interiority, of the collapsed, saturated relationality, which creates belonging, is constantly producing excess products. Because in order for a saturated interiority, which rubs up against limit, to be saturated in the first place, that saturation against a limit which is always permeable, because there is no such thing as a truly isolated system, is always going to produce, through that permeable limit, an excess product, constantly emitting an excess product. I mean, you know, just to, it's very sort of like thermodynamical, but constantly emitting excess product. Now, what is that excess product? Could be love, could be music, could be any number of things. Could be a baby, whatever it is, YouTube videos. And then those products are then in themselves now objects which are interacting with the world. So there's a lot of indeterminate, transdeterminate, I would say transdeterminate production occurring there. And then the last thing I'll bring up I'll just problematize everything I was just saying by saying that it's not exactly problematizing, but there's something that always has to be dealt with, which is that a saturated relationality. I'll just bring this open as an open question. We can discuss it. So a saturated relationality produces a non-dynamical relation, as discussed, which doesn't always produce a sense of belonging. Under certain conditions, and again, they may be related to scale, excess saturation of relation can create what I can't remember the guy who coined this phrase, but it's an interesting thing I've just been reading up on and just found out about, but a behavioral sink. And the description of a behavioral sink was come up with by this, I don't know, biologist who was studying rats, whose name is eluding me. And he created a world for these rats in a lab that could sustain something like 4,000 rats in a colony. And he gave them everything they needed. And so at first they're producing and mating like crazy. And the colony grows to be something like 2,000 large or something like this. Now the colony could hold 4,000 and sustain 4,000, but at a certain threshold of relation, all of a sudden, their pro-social, procreational behavior, even their drive, suddenly evaporated. They no longer produced. The men became basically impotent and no longer cared to eat. They just sort of exhibited a behavioral sink. And then I was just randomly looking up other things, and there's this phenomena in Japan that they called hikomori. You know about it?
Yeah, they never leave the apartment.
Never leave the apartment. Now, it's characterized by severe social withdrawal and so on. Now, it doesn't last forever. Apparently, it lasts, or they characterize it as anyone who's suddenly socially withdrawing and exhibiting a behavioral sink for in excess of 6 months. Now, why would that happen, right? And I would theorize that it's an excess relationality, in this case, an abstract relationality, but the excess relationality of the internet. When there's just too many abstract relational joint points to flooding our ontological phenomenological space. Because of course, we need negativity against which to produce the positivity of relation. When we have an ontological flood of relation, we no longer can delineate between categories. So why well, here's the open question. Is hikomori, and I don't know the answer to this, producing a sense of, is it producing the same phenomenological state of interior belonging for these sort of isolated characters who no longer feel they need to participate? Is there a sense of sort of like satori, enlightened, phenomenologically replete and finalized last man, Nietzschean sort of last man state, which is isomorphic to the feeling and state of belonging in an indeterminate sense to the interior of a real tribe? Or is it somehow the polar opposite? And what's the difference there? And what's the difference essentially between hikomori and the sensation of belonging in phenomenological terms?
Oh, that is so magnificent. Please, please.
I would just say, which recalls my monk or drunk problem, right? Is it like, what's the difference phenomenologically between the interior state of the monk or the drunk? When their behaviorally almost look identical, sitting there in their stupor. They're both occupying a state of indeterminacy. So how do you characterize the difference qualitatively or quantitatively? So these are all fun questions. Yeah.
Oh, they're magnificent. So a few things. As just a little pen, the qualitative difference might be on the virtual, which would have terms on the reconciliation of the unfolding of the potential with the actual. And then you were also talking about this kind of reconciliation with this kind of idea that philosophy is in the business of reconciling with what is. This is kind of the Hegelian notion as well. And this is what's weird. The act, the state of reconciliation with the unfolding is the drunk or the monk. It's the same, but the relation of the virtual seems to be different, which I'm associating with the thought as opposed to the actual that entails a potentiality that is being worked out. Whereas, say, one could be because it's also very fascinating to compare, say, the Amish.
Could you parse that a little more? When you say virtual, what do you mean exactly? Because these are terms that.
Sure. Absolutely. I have in mind when I talk about the virtual, basically the idea, the concept, the thought, whereas potential is what is located in the actuality of a thing. So, for example, in the actuality of a bridge is the potential of collapse. That is not virtual. It is part of the very actuality of the bridge is that potential. Now, the idea of, say, crossing the bridge in my car, that would be on virtual. That is possible because of the actual, but the idea itself of which is afforded because of the actuality, of which also has to take into account the potentiality of it falling, so I wouldn't want to go across an old bridge, is what then affords me the possibility of virtually considering the possibility of going on it and thus participating in the actuality of the bridge as such. That's what I have in mind with the virtual. What are your thoughts on that, Mr. Ebert?
Well, that would be fine, except that I do think we probably have to distinguish between potential and possible, so that when we see the bridge, we know that it could possibly collapse, but we can't see. So possibility is that which is not in excess of our ability to schematize. We see the bridge, we know there's one of an array of possibilities. Potential necessarily must be in excess of our ability to schematize and thereby somewhat absent from our ability to cognize.
Sure.
And so in that, it presents a problem with distinguishing potentiality from virtuality. Because virtuality could also be described as that which is in excess of our ability to cognize, and thereby indeterminate and so on. And so then what's the difference between potentiality and virtuality? What I would say is that it's still something I'm working through, but I would say that the bridge, speaking phenomenologically, has a hidden potential. It has the possibilities which we can, are very determined. It could fall, it could do this, it could do that, and that's about it. It could decay, and so on and so forth. But could it become a sheep? Could it become a pink dragon and then gobble me up and then, turn me into a Gila monster? And then, the infinite array of potentiality in terms of like energetic potentiality. Now, where would a bridge gain that sort of potential? Well, probably not in its actuality.
Right.
But like in its, ontic actuality, but in its, now see, some people use ontological to describe actual reality, but I use ontological to describe the schematization of the perception of reality.
Yeah.
But anyway, its potentiality, as described as infinite, exists within the very ontological schematic category of the mind which identifies it. In other words, again, back to the mantra, if you saturate the category of bridge, and I mean this in a very subjective, phenomenological way, but it's not trivial that we can saturate a category and repotentiate it into an indeterminate state. That we can know what something is in determinate terms and then suddenly, intentionally, make it indeterminate so that suddenly it can mean anything. It comes back to the idea, which I think is great. I love this idea of Daniel. Who's Daniel? He's Daniel. In relation to nothing. He's just Daniel. And all of a sudden, Daniel's like, okay, well, then I guess Daniel's anything. And suddenly we repotentiate you, right? Now, you can do that with any object. You can do it with bridge. You just have to saturate the category bridge and make bridge bridge. What bridge? Just bridge. Bridge. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh shit, bridge is anything. Now, for a lot of people and scientists especially, they're going to be like, you guys are just wanking off, right? But it's a very important and crucial aspect of how the mind works. And it actually is really crucial in terms of how we orient ourselves to scientific thinking, because it has to do with what is absent. And if we can't grapple with what is absent, then we have no idea of how to make sense of what we can't make sense of. Anyway, so when we're talking about, you know, I know I took us on a big diversion, but I almost, my hunch is almost to set aside virtuality for a moment and just deal with actual and potential. I do think that the virtual is really crucial. And I like, and I somewhat agree with you when you say something like the virtual is the notion of thought. There is a perfect indeterminacy there that maybe I just have to work through more. At the moment, for me, the virtual is the interiorized exteriority. And there's an intentional contradiction there, by which I mean virtuality is the future. It is the imagined relational collapse of an exteriority which is not yet relationally collapsed. It is the imagined belonging, the imagined interiority. So whereas potentiality is the indeterminate relational collapse of the present interiority.
Yeah, no, I would completely agree with that. And again, language is difficult. I completely understand. And to me, what's very interesting is there does seem to be a difference between potential and possible that is afforded by, say, the virtual, but then the virtual is already formatted by the actual. And so you have this kind of, as some have said in Hegel, the absolute idealism, where the problem is these things are already being schematized by one another. And yet, there seems to be a qualitative difference in the experience of them. And this is where, like when we're talking about, say, in Japan versus, say, someone who's, we could go back to someone, say, the 1820s, who finds kind of belonging in a, not leaving town, but they have their kind of roots. The someone in the 1820s, though, this is where pluralism and global pluralism for me is so central to belonging again. It's really not a thought of difference. They, you know that there are people living in China, you know that there are Hindus, but they're not your neighbor. They're not people that are part of your interiority that are thus upsetting your stability. And so the thought of a future collapsed state that could entail the Hindu does not bother you. Whereas today, if you're isolated and if you're more isolated and have access to the internet, or you're watching television, or maybe you're stuck because of work, that possibility, the very thought of the possibility is disturbing your interiority, which I think is kind of a big difference, like, because your thoughts are part of your interiority. Like when you live in the 1820s and it's really, you're a Christian and you know that there are people who are not Christian, but they're all bad people, right? You just kind of other them or something, right? Thus the thought of the good atheist or the person that actually might even be better than the Christian is not really part of your interiority. Thus, you get a stable state. Thus, you're able to find belonging. But now, because of information exposure, unless you're, say, truly isolated, then you know of these ideas, you know of these real things that you've encountered, and so they're part of your interiority that are disturbing it. So you're living in, I mean, what you see is, what's interesting is, like I said, the difference between, say, people that are more Amish or people that would be more in Japan, and also the difference of people that, say, are living in an apartment because they feel like there's no hope in the market. Like, you'll see a lot of people when you interview in Japan, they're like, well, I'll never get married. I'll never be able to afford a house. What's the point? So it's more of a, in China, they talk about laying flat or different things, right? So it's like, why even try? That seems to be different, though, than, say, well, I just keep using the Amish or the Mennonite, who are definitely more kind of turning away from society. But it's also not because they feel like they don't have a chance, but because they feel like the interiority that they established is good for them. And this would be an example of how people are getting belonging. But I would argue, like, belonging, again, is going to talk about things like Japan is a great example, Duginism, Amish, and then transhumanism, all as efforts by which people are trying to find belonging or deal with things like the meta crisis or the meaning crisis. And the book tries to go through each and show the unintentional consequences of each. It's no doubt at all that more isolationist strategies can work, but are we willing to sacrifice the internet, global trade, technology, and things like that, right? Because the moment you have access to those things, you're able to introduce into your mind the existence of the other person who is different, of which then to reestablish a certain stability in your interiority, you basically almost have to demonize them or somehow say they're wrong. The real challenge of belonging, again, is believing that difference can be different and they not be bad, that they can be different and it actually be just as fine as your interiority, and that not lead to a radical destabilization of your interiority. That is the radical challenge. And I think those would be, so for me, there is something isomorphic per se in the actual in potentiality, the way that it's unfolding between the Japanese and the Amish, but the difference is in that relation to the future, we'll just say, versus using the kind of the idea of what could be. And what's so interesting in Hegel is, like you were saying, there is this notion of reconciliation coming to terms with the pure openness of the future, rather than having, like philosophy be in the business of having ideas of how things should be. Instead, you figure out how to keep yourself from imagining the future, but actually letting yourself participate or reconcile to the unfolding of the actual potential, which is very difficult precisely because you have to do it in terms of your mind. Your mind's always getting in the way. But here's also the critical point. Your mind seems to be critical for the possibility of what you were describing as the band. This kind of new interiority that's going on, that seems to be the more that human beings can participate in that kind of thing, the more that the unfolding of the absolute seems to give rise to generative and creative possibilities that otherwise could not occur. Dare I say, even be creatively progressive without being too moral about it or anything. And so what's very interesting, so a few things. When you describe the band, which I think is exactly right as this kind of self-forgetting, which means the dimorphism between the band members moves almost between the band and the audience. The dimorphism is no longer between the people in the band. If they're performing, it kind of goes to the outside, right? Is that fair to say? This is what's very critical. Right now, in political thought or organizational thought, we have a term for the individual, atomization, per se, but then we jump from that to decentralization. But there's actually, and then we go from that to, say, capital or the unity or centralization, right? There actually is a missing step there that I think is kind of very, very critical. And I almost want to call it meta-decentralization because I'm not sure what other term to use. The band right there is what I would kind of call meta-decentralization, which is found where all of the individuals forget themselves. But it's not the same as like decentralization in terms of voting or broken down, you know, all the things that go with the Dunbar numbers and stuff like that. And the trick that has caused so much trouble is we've in the past attempted decentralization without means of incubating meta-decentralization. So what has occurred is there hasn't been a middle step that is needed to avoid just falling back into atomization, or then the different individuals under decentralization just fighting or ultimately say creating slavery or doing some sort of terrible thing to someone that then an outsized decentralized unit, do we stop that? Do we get involved? What do we do about it, right? So there's this notion of a kind of meta-decentralization that is precisely in a state where a self-forgetfulness is entered into, where people find belonging. But here's the trick. In order to have the belonging of the band, can you use that to start creating laws of how everyone should live? There's a limit. There's an inherent limit to meta-decentralization in that it only applies if you have the skills to do the music, if you are on the stage, if you are there, and you can't necessarily use those conditions of belonging for anything else other than the band condition, right? Whereas in decentralization, you could say, well, this is what every community should be like. They shouldn't have fossil fuels. They should all be vegan. They should all have these sort of principles, right? And that's something that can then kind of force something about other people. And here's the problem. It is going to be very difficult to deal with, dare I say, the trauma of decentralization, knowing that other people are different from you, if you have no source to kind of help you come to terms of that, of a presence of meta-decentralization. That would help you gradually work through the difference between different states or different communities or different nations who are going to have different views of what's good for the environment. Let's say, like Jim Rutt was talking about this with Frege and Owen. He says, like in Gang B, it's going to be very decentralized. He talks about federalism, lots of experimentation, and I'm on board with all of that. But then he says, but we can all at least agree that it's good to maintain the environment, right? Like, let's protect the environment. Well, here's the issue. The groups may disagree on what helps the environment or what trade-offs are worth it or who should do what, right? So even when there's a kind of a shared self-evident moral per se, you could still have disagreement. How do you keep that disagreement from, and that would be the real, right, that comes forth, right? You see the limit of your good idea, right? So inevitably in decentralization, you're always going to eventually run into a limit, you know, a certain limitation of that decentralization. How do you encounter that limit and not be overwhelmed by it or turn into conflict or different things like that, right? Well, if you had practices of meta-decentralization, that would go a long way to condition you, to help you, because you wouldn't feel like all of your belonging is in jeopardy. You'll be like, oh, I've reached limits to my belonging, and I'm going to have to say, maybe negotiate with these people democratically to figure out how we can work with this. But it's not the only source. It's not that all of my belonging is in jeopardy because I still have the band. I still have these practices of flow, right? Because right now you could say the problem is people's belonging is too centralized in macro pictures. They'll say they're a Christian and that's all they got. They've got church and they encounter the Muslim or the atheist or the woke person. This person then, because all their eggs of belonging are in the basket of Christianity, this person then is a threat to their entire all interiority, right? Like they're overly centralized in this one source of belonging. So they go crazy. But what's so funny is you'll find that many people who are, say, religious, or they'll say, you know, Hindu or whatever, but they're also, say, artists, or they're also creatives or entrepreneurs or philosophical, they don't go nuts when somebody questions their Christianity, right? They don't have the explosion because it's not overly centralized in that one identification, because they've had experiences of interiority that are a result of, say, being able to play in the band, to stay on that example, right? So right now what we have is if you're going to do decentralization, which seems to be what we need to do today, now the book has to justify that, but if we take something like decentralization necessary, what also has to be available in those decentralized units is sources of meta-decentralization, which are very, very odd because they seem to be necessary due to an objective condition that is not the same as like a building or a wall, right? Like being good in a band. Is that something you can like buy at Lowe's? Is that something you can find? No, it's a skill. And it's a skill that also requires courage, sacrifice, development of the subject. You work really, really hard to get to the place where you can do something that's kind of radically contingent. It's not held up by anything, but then when you do it right, you vanish. You know, the term I like Keller uses, self-forgetful. Like when you're in this flow state, you vanish and you find this radical kind of belonging. So you work really, really hard per se in your atomization, in your individuality, not to stay there, like the Horkamori or the people in the apartments. When you're alone at night working at your skill, you're not thinking about how capitalism has cheated you. You're not thinking about how you'll never get married. You're thinking about the future of the collapsed state of the band, of the meta-decentralization. So you have a different orientation to the future, and you've reconciled yourself to having to participate in the now so that it would be possible for you to participate in that experience of the interiority that is found in the band, that though isomorphic to, say, being locked into the apartment, you have a different idea of what it is for, or what it is toward, or how it could unfold, which changes the experience. And to me, on the rat utopia experience, that you were, I think that's John Calhoun and Samuel Barnes and Owen were talking about this, a very important experiment. That experiment shows you a few things. One, it shows you, for me, it shows you what happens if you have no means of meta-decentralization. Because, and it also, here's the other thing, it shows you that an economy that can only stimulate demand, create comfort, solve problems, eventually eats itself. Like Keynes talks about how in capitalism, demand naturally collapses. I call it the demand event horizon. And when demand falls below a certain point, you don't recover. It's very difficult without liquidity. The government has to stimulate inflation, but all of these things contribute to wealth inequality. Or let's put it this way. Generally, when the government stimulates the economy, it does so by increasing asset value. Well, that benefits the people who have assets, but a lot of people don't have assets, or a lot of people don't own stocks. They don't own equity, right? So you start getting the kind of the Piketty stuff. Now, a lot more has to be said on that because we have to compare McCloskey, Pontier, and Piketty. But anyway, the point is, it would seem as if basically what ends up happening is that the very successes of the economy and the centralization and all these different things that create an atmosphere of comfort work back on the drive of the mice or people in comfort that lets them then say, what's the point? Like, why even try? And they start rolling over. And to me, this would say the necessity of something like the possibilities in society for forms of meta-decentralization, like being the band. Because here's the other thing with the band. As soon as you're done, and then I'll give it back to you, as soon as you're done, it's gone. All you have is the memory of that interiority, right? Like, but that means you need to come back. The drive is still alive. Whereas if your drive is to be comfortable or to get food or to get, once you got it, you're done, right? But if your belonging is found in something transient, more transient, but it is possible because you've experienced it, that means your society can now create demand, not just stimulate demand, because people themselves begin creating their lives in a manner to meet those conditions so that they can undergo that meta-decentralization that we're talking about. I'll stop there. There's more to be said, but let me give it back to you.
Yeah, I just had a bunch of thoughts. I'll see if I can remember them. But the meta-decentralization, I'm sort of transcribing in my mind as sort of nested interiorities.
Sure. And that's a term I just literally came up with, so we don't have to die by that term. I'm just trying to figure out nested interiorities. Sure.
Or in terms of all your eggs being in one basket and so on. And then I wonder with the behavioral sink and that particular rat experiment. Two things. Well, three things. One, it seems like, and I've long been curious about this, and I like having pieces of evidence that support this. The drive is not actually interminable, and that if we can achieve a non-dynamical interiority that is total and does not experience exteriority, is not brought into problematic environmental, and by problematic I mean non-automatic, in other words, predictive error scenarios, meaning where's the food? What do you mean there's no food? Or meaning why does that rat have food and I don't, right? Predictive error. In this experiment, all rats were taken care of. All rats were comfortable to a fault. And there was this relational collapse. Now, if only some of the rats, if there was a rat elite and difference had been created, I wonder if the behavioral sink would have occurred. If the rat colony, second idea, was set up just next to another rat colony that was in a different area, but they could all see them, and that was somehow made aware of each other, and made aware that they were somehow in competition with one another, I wonder if the behavioral sync would occur. In other words, if there had been any sense of self-alienation or exteriority, either way, if there had been any sense of phenomenological exteriority, like, oh, they're rich, them versus me, or, oh, that colony versus our colony, that interiority versus our interiority, any semblance of difference, relational difference, if the behavioral sync would have occurred. But in lieu of difference, at the point of total interiority, we are actually returned to the womb. The interiority of self-same phenomenological interiority, which does not experience exteriority, that sensation preceding the interior-exterior split, which instantiates drive in the first place. All right, so you have this necessity of difference. You have drive being instantiated according to Freud and according to me, if I can put myself in his company, at birth upon the interior-exterior split. Drive is essentially static drive, as I call it, is this mode to return to a state of interior stasis. But again, even if you reach that interior stasis with regard to a given belonging, that given belonging has a boundary which itself is placed within exteriority, conditions of alienation. And so it's always that you're always belonging to an interior that is in dynamic relation with other determinate objects. But in the case of this rat experiment, where all there is interiority, and there is no difference relationally, then drive is fully sated. And you actually have the resolution of static drive as the last man, the Nietzschean last man, which all these rats exhibited in their behavioral sync. Absolute relational stasis, absolute interiority is the cessation of drive. So the idea that drive only resolves upon death, I think, is incorrect. It's just so rare that we would ever experience an interiority that is not placed within an exterior, that we never really encounter the resolution of drive. But if we were to encounter the resolution of drive as a pure absolute interiority under some random conditions where we're convinced that all that exists is this world that has been fully relationally saturated, then I think we probably would experience a cessation of drive. I am in a relationship with my fiance that is so good, so satisfying, so relationally unifying, such a beautiful interiority, such a relational saturation, such a collapse, such a constant sense of indeterminacy between her and I, a growing sense of it, that a lot of my preoccupations with fame, success, my various projects has absolutely lessened. Yeah. All of a sudden, I'm a hobbyist. Yeah, maybe I'll finish those albums. I don't know. Now, I love it. I love that because I'm fucking relaxed, right? But what if that was the only world there was, and we weren't in a city, we had no exteriority, we didn't ever experience alienation within our interiority of the exterior world, we had no sense of differential objects? Well, then I might not even be on this podcast. You might call me. And by the way, I've been behaving in a way that's very strange. Someone engaged me to sing the other day for a documentary. I was like, yeah, sure. Day came, I was like, nah, I don't think so. Yeah, I can't be bothered. Why? Now, that's very not me. I'm an incredibly historically ambitious person. everybody who knows me as the guy that works more, the hardest working person they know. Never shuts up my brain. And then now I've established this interiority with someone, this relational saturation, which has seen my exterior ambitions, which themselves are all preoccupations with recreating the very stasis I'm now within. Phenomenologically, that static state of like, what is fame, for instance? What is the idea of fame, or what is the idea of finishing a project? But the establishing, like, what is a book? It is a static object that contains your ideas that were, theoretically dynamical, now valleys and peaks, now established in a sort of Platonic plateau of object. That is belonging again. And there it is. Look at that object. It is now eternalized in constant form. There is a constancy now, because you've put it on in black and white, to all those thoughts. So every time I put it on an album, every time we do almost anything, we are constantly trying to create these sensations of stasis. Whether it's getting the PhD or settling your identity in one manner or the other, or getting married, or any of these things, we're constantly doing that. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. It's great. It's in a lot of ways the very creation of differential objects. I mean, I'm so glad now I get to interact dynamically with this inert unity called belonging again too. So I get to interact dynamically with an inert, non-dynamical object. And that's part of what makes the world fun and dynamic, is that it's full of these internally unified objects. Orange, pineapple. I don't think about like what kind of pineapple is. That would be a prediction error. And then I'd have to schematize that. And all of a sudden I'd be like, oh yeah. And then I'm again back into the world of automaticity, interacting with inert objects in my schematized brain, because that's the only economical way to interact with the world, and so on. But when we, or if we, were able to produce a pure interiority, I do think we would see the cessation of drive, and we see the last man. And I do think that the premise, at least, of a World Wide Web, if you collapse the frequency of speed of interactions to fully saturated upon the limit of relationality, you just imagine, like a fully transactional world, a fully interactive world in which all points of interaction collapse upon the same moment, then yeah, I think that we would see the collapse of drive, which would be the culmination of the, in some ways, the culmination of the human project, culmination of the human mind. And I don't know, it recalls Cadel's phrase, global brain singularity, right? Because the thing is that at that point, while we would be individually non-dynamical with relation, intersubjectively non-dynamical in that relational collapse, we would now be a unity that has established a limit, a membrane, which itself then interacts dynamically as a determinate object with what? Alien life forms, with the rest of the galaxy, as a single brain. Anyway, total speculation, but just, I love extrapolating that behavioral sync experimentation all the way to its apotheosis.
No, all of that is magnificent. And you've put your finger. So basically everything you just said is the problem of motivation that modern economics has not thought, and so it falls into low growth and proves self-effacing. Like, the problem is modern economics and society assumes a theory of motivation of the rational agent, where humans are motivated by what they think is rational and what's going to solve their needs and scarcity and so on and so forth. And this model, as a depiction of a historic episode, has its use. But what do you do when people have all their needs, or et cetera, so forth? Well, then they stop striving. They stop doing things, right? Which is not necessarily bad. It just depends, right? So you start to have a certain sort of collapse of the drive in the economy. And then funny enough, if low growth can lead to social tensions or turmoil or collapses of housing, because then people are like, I don't need to build houses, I don't need to provide running water, then the society falls apart, you have political tensions, right? So here's the issue. There is a limit to drive in a sense. There is a limit that once it hits, let's put it this way. Modern economics operates assuming demand. Marx does it straight out the gate of capital. Keynes assumes demands. This is my argument. And when they talk about creating demand, they're actually talking about stimulating demand, not creating demand. And as a result, economics operates by motivating people through stimulation. And here are ways you stimulate: envy, greed, want, consumerism, necessity, inventing scarcity like Ivan Egg. These are all methods of stimulating action. I'm going to convince you to do something because there's wealth. You were talking about if next to the rat utopia there was inequality, they may still act because they may be stimulated to go to war and take all of their stuff, dang it. So they're not going to just behaviorally sink. We've only ever figured out how to deal with the problem of behavioral sink, to use that language, through stimulation. But there are limits to stimulation. Eventually, you can't stimulate anymore other than going to war or something. But then that would be nukes, World War III, end of the world. So that's kind of off the table, or could be. It depends. That we have to get into more on that. But generally speaking, so right now what you have is it's kind of like, I always link the rat utopia with the Kafka story, A Little Fable. And it's a really David Foster Wallace has a lovely essay on it. And anyway, there's this mouse going down this hall, and he goes, oh me, oh my, I see the trap up ahead, but the walls are closing in, and what will I do? You simply have to change your direction, said the cat, and ate up the mouse. It's this old story, and that's basically what's happening now, is we have found ourselves heading toward either behavioral sink as the trap, or the mouse says, well, you just got to stop stimulating demand and create it. And then it eats us because all we know how to do is stimulate demand. We don't know how to create demand, right? And so to me, as you know, I'll talk about the self-effacement drive, because the idea is that the very thing that right now defines driving in society is actually a stimulation that eventually reaches a point that then there's no reason to do anything. But this is what's so funny. That could be a state of, dare I say, spiritual enlightenment. You don't need movies. You don't need to go do anything. This could be the beatific vision. Or what is the difference between the beatific vision of Dante? That's the example I always use. What's the difference between that and the rat utopia? This is a pretty radical.
It's the drunker monk problem.
Yes,
and it's very difficult to solve. It's very difficult to solve. Yeah, go on.
That's exactly the theory of motivation that economics operates according to, which then spills over into politics and sociology and everything, is not solving that problem. It does not address that problem. It assumes that problem will be worked out, basically, because it assumes demand. It'll all work out. The rat utopia is one giant screaming example that it may not actually, that it may not work out, that there's some sort of contingency that has to be taken very, very seriously. And to me, it has a lot to do with and to me, again, freak theory as a schema is very important and useful to describe this problem or to think this problem. Because so you made the great example of in your relationship, and that's wonderful to hear. Congratulations. That's a wonderful thing, having that deep interiority. Why would you care about fame if you have that, right? But at the same time, it seems kind of problematic that you don't care about things on the outside, right? And yet, can we really moralize that? It depends on, here's the problem. It depends on what level of scale. If you're talking globally, yes, it is a problem because people aren't, say, doctors anymore because why? They don't need to be a doctor or they don't need to take care of pipes, right? But if you're talking individually, it's probably better to have the intimate interiority. So the problem of scale comes in. Let me give it to you. I see you want to speak, Mr. Ebert. Please.
I was just going to say that it's easy to forget that limit always presents itself, even to the limitlessness experience. So when I'm experiencing that, indeterminate interiority, that limitlessness, it itself has its own limit. Just like we were talking about, you know, Plato in the cave. Which is to say that the behavioral sink itself, like, as far as I know, the story of the behavioral sink at Nim, the rats of Nim, ends at the moment of the behavioral sink. That's the interesting observation. But what happened 60 days later if they let the experiment keep going? Half the rats die. They start eating each other. It turns into fucking Lord of the Flies, retribalization, and difference occurs again. There's always going to be a fucking limit that solves the problem of indeterminacy. There's always going to be an excess product to the saturation of collapsed relation. And that excess product, let's say, for instance, in the case of me and my fiance, is a child. So long, like fucking happy, indeterminate days, right? Like, adios. So all of a sudden now the relationship is completely disturbed by this third. And you're back in the throes of a dynamic interplay. And so that's again why limit is, it's almost probably eventually vexing. Like, there's probably a limit to talking about limit, because at a certain point you realize, oh shit, limit takes care of everything. I guess we don't need to be philosophers anymore. Like, is there a point at which, beyond which being a philosopher is like the excess product of the saturated philosophical conversation is not being a philosopher? The excess product is like, well, I guess I'd better just live my life then. I guess I don't need to continue thinking about this shit all day and exerting all my fucking calories just literally staring at my phone, like dictating, you know, neurotic thoughts. Because it's a very interesting predicament to be a person that is constantly thinking about problems that self-solve.
Yes, it is. So a few things. I love everything you just said. I think it is very important to realize that there's a limit to the indeterminacy, which then I think you're right with the rat utopia experience. I've been speaking with Michelle Bowens. There does in history seem to be historic forcing functions. Like in Generations with William Howe, they'll talk about sort of there's eventually the fourth turning is the popular phrase, but I much prefer the book in the 90s where they go through the whole case study, and then you have like Punganet and all of these books on cycles, and eventually what ends up happening, you have a society, drive dies. It's decadence, the age of decadence that they'll talk about, and then what ends up happening is that begins to eat itself. The decadence eats itself. The Dark Ages, although that way of describing the Middle Ages is simplistic, but there's still a collapse of a kind, which then gets it going again. And so and that occurs. The question becomes, is historically speaking, it is the case that conditions of possibility for new ways of, say, doing economics, doing politics, doing society, doing relations, don't tend to be realized at scale until a historic forcing function. You know, the famous phrase is the owl of Nineveh flies at dusk. It's important to realize that the dusk makes the owl fly. Nobody, you know, it's not merely coincidental. The dusk is why the owl takes flight, and anyone cares, unfortunately, in history.
Although a lot of the I mean, not a lot of them. I think you're right that most of the forcing functions are probably natural, quote unquote natural. If we could differentiate between manufactured and natural limitation, but manufactured limitation work also I would call environmentalism. Is basically based on attempting to create a manufactured limit, which is outrage, and to create a manufactured limit that precedes the actual limit, which would lead to our distinction. So we create extinction. So we create, I don't even know if manufactured limit is correct, but predecessor limits maybe manufactured limits is fine. I wouldn't say false limits because they can reify. In fact, that's what law is. I would say law largely is the design of preemptive. I think maybe preemptive limit is a good word, but preemptive limitation is precisely there to evade apocalyptic scenarios entailed in natural limitation. Yeah. So anyway, just to say that this isn't a nihilistic, the idea that like problems solve themselves is not to say that, well, we should all sit back and just allow life to be life. But that entailed within life is our natural predilection to creating preemptive limits. Go ahead.
Well, that's excellent, because exactly for me, a reason why the philosopher maybe always has a role or has a role is because there are always manufactured limits or could be manufactured limits versus natural or actual limits, if you will. And the issue is the philosopher is this weird mixture of being reconciled to the limits that are natural that you must encounter because they're part of the process, but they are not reconciled to passively accepting manufactured limits. Well, how do you tell the difference? Not easily. But this is where, to me, I've always been deeply inspired by the traditions of philosophy that are really, really interested in historic episodes or the ground. David Hume talks about the common life. By that, he's like, what's the lived experience in which philosophy is operating? Not imagining, but operating. Philosophy is putting checks and balances on the power of the king who's trying to oppress people. Oh, so philosophy is limiting power. Or another thing that is limiting manipulation. Somebody shows up, they say, hey, join my church and you'll be healed. You don't need to go to the doctor. And David Hume's like, no, miracles are unlikely. So don't get my freaking like aunt killed with your talk, right? So philosophy has a self-defense function, limiting the kind of manipulation you're susceptible to, and it's keeping totalizing power away. So limiting totalizing power. And so for David Hume, because that's always a risk, philosophy always has a role. Right? And then you talk about Michel Planier and personal knowledge. So, I talk about the counter-enlightenment and the modern counter-enlightenment. And then Hegel, all of them are locating philosophy intimately connected with an actual occurrence, an encounterology, if you will. So Michel Planier is like, hey, the nature of the brain is to make you think that you understand a hammer without using it. You need philosophy to keep your brain from doing that and to put your hand, to not think that all knowledge is to limit abstract knowledge. One of the reasons I like freak theory is because it situates philosophy as some sort of art of limitation, being able to tell what limits are manufactured, what limits are not manufactured, where power should be limited, where your abstract knowledge should be limited. But then philosophy also, just to your point, needs to be able to say, I'm not needed right now. And let's turn off for 2 years. So that's a limit too, right? Like really, there's a way in which the love of wisdom is a kind of love of limits, because wisdom is fundamentally a kind of limitation thing, a realm thing, a membrane thing. Wisdom is not a cross your legs and float to the sky kind of thing. Wisdom is a sort of, you're stupid, smack, you're dumb. Don't forget that. There is something fundamentally limiting about wisdom. And if we think about limit, and another reason, I guess so again, on the I'm really glad you said that, because the historic episode, honestly, that I go back to the most of all is, well, there's three, but the one most of all is World War I. Why World War I happened with the Guns of August. It's an extraordinary episode, the American Civil War, but the one I go back the most is the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kershaw's books and different things like that. We really don't understand how close we were to the apocalypse. And it was basically luck. Kershaw's book, I think it's called I really like him. Countdown to the Armageddon. Like, I'm kind of obsessed with the Cuban, honestly, confession, I'm kind of obsessed with the Cuban Missile Crisis, because you go hour by frickin' hour and you're like, oh my gosh. And to me, I've always wondered if philosophy actually could have helped with that, because basically what it was luck. Like, if there would have been in, say, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which basically at the end of the day, everyone's like, we're following rationality, big Nash equilibria, game theory, you're in that your hallway, what do we do? I guess we got to end the world. Pause. What did you say? We have no choice. What do you mean you have no choice but to end the world? That doesn't make any sense. They literally can't limit rationality. They can't limit the game theory dynamics, right? Because it doesn't even occur to them the philosophical thought of limitation being necessary for thought and rationality not to eat itself is not there. Like the Cuban Missile Crisis is a kind of episode of behavioral sink, if you will, or the rat utopia. Everyone, like, what do? And it also shows you that rationality without limit ends up in game theories, Nash equilibria. It ends in these suboptimal results. Because this is the funny thing. You know how we've talked a lot about how there's something very important about suboptimal to avoid efficiency and all that? Funny enough, autonomous rationality ends up in the ultimate suboptimal, which is the apocalypse, which is so suboptimal that you almost can't even call it suboptimal because there's no sub anymore. There's just nothing. Anyway, but what you see there is what if those people in the Cuban Missile Crisis, or even in diplomacy at large right now globally, understood thought as entailing an inherent limitation? Would that change the character of diplomacy? Would that change the character of how people think and negotiate? Would that thought in of itself transform how politics went along? Maybe not. I'm not saying it necessarily would, but it is hard for me to imagine because I definitely think much of history or the unfolding into the open future is decided by how people talk to one another. Like conversation, diplomacy, negotiation, like conversation is central for the unfolding of the future. And philosophy seems to have an ability to transform how people talk or what they talk about. This is to me the key. I'm interested in philosophy, and I have more to say, but I'll throw it back at you. I'm very interested in philosophy has tried to develop big systems. It's tried to develop perfect states. What it should, in my opinion, philosophy is in the business of quality of basically at the end of the day, conversation, because you're always conversing relative to thoughts. And introducing limitation as the generative principle to discuss, to negotiate, and to engage in diplomacy over, to me, is how you start talking about radical changes in the system. Like, so for example, everyone knows about the game A, game B debate. You know, we're going to make a game B, we're going to decentralize, global federation, whatever. All of that to me is basically going to end up eventually in a behavioral sink if you're not talking about transformation in the way that people talk to one another, because that's ultimately informational, free exchange in the way that people exchange ideas, not just the content of the ideas, but the very character and formulation of the ideas. People now talk in a manner that doesn't orbit limit, figure out limit. Where is the limit? In fact, people mostly talk to evade limit or to escape limit, to actually figure out how to avoid, say, lack, which actually, if you face and you can see as generative. And if you focus on that, philosophy has a kind of function. But let me throw it back at you.
Don't you think game theoretic philosophy really is all about sort of confronting the limitation of not knowing what your adversary may choose, and thereby, because of that unknown, choosing the most selfish path forward in the prisoner's dilemma and so on, because you don't know whether or not your adversary or comrade is going to choose to rat on you or get the gold themselves or collaborate and show up and split the gold. You have to go ahead and stab them in the back. I want to bring up this reminds me of, you know, Donald Rumsfeld, who was the what was he? The Secretary of Defense.
Yeah.
He's got this quote that's rather famous at this point. He said, and there was a great movie about this called Known Unknowns or something like this.
Yeah.
God, great documentarian. Can't remember his name. Oh, Errol Morris. So anyway, he goes, reports that something hasn't happened are always interesting to me because, as we know, there are known knowns. This basically describes the difference between actuality, potentiality, and virtuality. Known knowns, meaning things we know. There are also known unknowns. That is, things we know there. That is to say, we know there are some things we don't know. Sort of describes potentiality. Then there are unknown unknowns. the ones we don't know, we don't know. And if one looks throughout the history of our country and other free countries, it is the latter category that tends to be the difficult ones. So unknown unknowns being sort of, the virtual, known unknowns being potential, and then known knowns being actual. And that's the defense secretary during the Iraq War and so on, confronting in very real terms the limitations of epistemic knowledge and ontological categorization with regard to geopolitical warfare. And in a lot of ways, it's not that the limitations aren't confronted, it's that the very notion of the indeterminacy, that veil, prompts the multipolar trap, whereby because you don't know what your adversary may do or what the other may be thinking, because of that classical Lacanian anxiety, you just go ahead and do what will entail your own survival because you must assume that the other will be doing the same. And so I'm not sure that it's that the limits of our thinking are not considered, but that, I don't know, I suppose that's the end of that thought there, but there's something with regard to politics and ontological limitation.
What you're getting at is huge, because for me, the problem is game theory is basically saying that we know that we're limited, but you're still assuming a rational agent. And actually on the systems level, we do know what's optimal, because in the prisoner's dilemma, we're actually going to do what seems like it's not rational, but the outcome is most rational. So it's an illusion of a limitation. You know how you were talking about manufactured limits, like, like environmental things? There's also what game theory has done to me, in my opinion, and I speak with Lorenzo about this, is game theory has kind of taught us the exact opposite of what it should have taught us. What it's done is you say, hey, there's game theory. So to be really rational, what we got to do is move to the systems level, and that's what we're going to have rational. But the problem is you're moving limit out of the encounter. You know how you've been saying that limit has to be encountered in order to truly be limit. Once you systemize it and come up with a game theory, you're not encountering the limit, you're gaming the limit, if you will. Because what you're doing, because it turned out like this is why the Cuban Missile Crisis is so fascinating. If you assume with Khrushchev, when you're speaking with Kennedy, if you were being rational, he would never remove, I guess, the Jupiter missiles from Turkey, because there was this big thing where Kennedy begged, I believe it's Khrushchev, because they're going to remove the missiles from Turkey. And Kennedy's like, if you do that, it's going to be like a big failure on the administration. So make me a promise. Never, ever make it public to the American people that you do this, okay? Because it would risk and Khrushchev agreed. But you know what Khrushchev also did? He also didn't tell the Russians that he did it. And that would have been a huge success for him, but he kept it secret. And it actually probably cost him big politically. Why did he do that? Why did he do that? It wasn't rational, but that's what he did. It's not what you would have ever predicted in your schema. You know why he didn't do it? Because he was believing that this was going to be the beginning of a new trust relationship with Kennedy, that if he took the extra step, if Kennedy was in office, America and the Soviet Union could learn to be together, because Khrushchev is going to do something that's in a way non-rational, because he's valuing the trust as an individual over what actually would get him politically interested. Now, here's the issue. In one sense, you could say that's rational because trust matters, but let me explain to you why it turned out not to be. Because Kennedy was assassinated. So Khrushchev made this huge sacrifice, didn't get anything out of it, and then was removed and got into huge trouble, right? History is a story of people doing things that your game theory dynamics would not actually show is the case. But on a systems level, because your system doesn't calculate things like trust, it calculates only rational action. It doesn't calculate things like people valuing, say, their long-term reputation or avoiding the apocalypse, then that's not calculated. But that can be realized in the encounter of Kennedy and Khrushchev. And the big thing is Kennedy and Khrushchev through the back lines actually had like communication that nobody knew about. So they're encountering one another. And that encounter with Kennedy personalized him. to where then someone like Kirchhoff said, no, trust matters. So this would be my main point. Game theory dynamics would not tell you that you need to open back channels of communication with the Soviet Union. It would never lead you to that, because it gives you the illusion of, we know all of we know we don't know this. This game shows us what we need to do, knowing we don't know this, and therefore we're going to have to, I guess, kill everyone, right? You know, this is what we're stuck. We've got to figure out what is the action that doesn't seem rational that actually is rational relative to this dynamic. But guess what? That is all a framing of the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. What that doesn't unveil to you is where the key thing you need to do is create back channels of communication with the Soviet Union and send letters and stuff. That's completely outside the dynamic. So yeah, game theory as an image of limit is fine, but the problem is we tend to think the image of the limit per se makes up for the encounter of the limit,
Okay,
and
all right, so let's differentiate between, because I like where you're going here. So we have encounter, I think that's important, but we can't say that game theoretics are evade quantitative thresholds, because a lot of the game theoretic conclusions were arrived at vis-a-vis
hitting a limit.
Large quantitative computational models which ran the game theoretic conditions over and over and over again, and very often with actual humans. It did depend which humans were running the game theoretic models. When they tried early on to use their secretaries, who were largely women, all of their predictions crumbled because the women were more likely to collaborate, which is one of the rare arguments for a sort of matriarchal handing off of power. But so there is a quantitative threshold aspect to game theoretical conclusions. So there is encounter, and they did use humans. However, maybe we could say, I don't know, I'm fishing here, but maybe we could say that the difference between the kind of encounter you're referring to and the kind of encounter that was the kind of abstracted encounters, obviously there's sort of an environmental difference. One is an abstracted container, let's say, which does not come with a true phenomenology of risk because it's a game. Whereas perhaps encounter comes with skin in the game.
Yes.
You can say there's no skin in the game in any of their computational modeling. And somehow the lack of skin in the game produces outcomes that are sort of divorced from or carry a dearth of ontological reality, and thereby the outcomes are sort of surreal and fraudulent with regard to real world predicament. Now, I would like to bring that into the notion of interiority and exteriority and say that those computational models were carried out in a pure interiority, diluted and denuded from an exterior conditions, diluted and denuded from problematicity, prediction error, and thereby absent of exterior conditions, no prediction errors could be present. And so you end up with a sort of homogeny of outcomes that leads one or led them to believe that these outcomes from these computational models were legitimate outcomes. But in fact, these outcomes the processes which led to these outcomes hadn't encountered prediction errors, hadn't encountered people behaving in anomalistic ways, hadn't encountered an environment, therefore, that was external to the conditions of the game. So the game created a total interiority, which would then, of course, produce self-same outcomes and convince one that those outcomes were legitimate. And I don't know if what I'm saying is true, if those, I'd have to really think about whether or not, like, for instance, the prisoner's dilemma and so on, are void of exteriority. It's a tough question. If those are totally contained containers, which, like, true closed systems of game. Of course, no closed system actually exists in the universe. And it's used just for sort of thermodynamical interpretation, but there is no true closed system. And so perhaps the interiority of the game disturbed the truthfulness of those outcomes. But either way, there is something that you're pointing at with regard to encounter, where if we could say that a true encounter and false encounter, or we could differentiate encounter from shit, I don't know. I mean, there were quantitative thresholds that they were surpassing, and the excess product was the computational outcomes of game theoretic models. So clearly, there's something to the environment within which one is conducting these experiments, yes, including the rats of Nim sort of behavioral sink, which was a pure interiority, and thereby produced a behavioral sink that wouldn't otherwise occur in a world that was not contained in a closed system, which the world is not. And so that some of these experiments are producing false results, false with regard to lived experience. Anyhow, yeah.
No, magnificent. And when you say rats and Nim, I think of the movie where she has the necklace and the center block is pulled out and they save all the baby mice. So thank you. It takes me back to my childhood. Few things. Outstanding. Absolutely. Game theory arose as an encounter of various limitations, whether we go to John Nash, Kenneth Arrow, et cetera, so forth. And those had a historic episode that was necessary, but they should be used as evidence for the need to bring in surprise, encounter, and skin in the game, not the idea of creating a rational sort of system on the level that moves it. So game theory, also to the women's points. What's very interesting is that the effectiveness of avoiding Nash equilibria skyrockets when you introduce diversity into the collective system that is trying to solve the problem. So Lorenzo will talk about collective consciousness faced with Nash equilibria. The amount of diversity greatly increases the probability that you avoid the suboptimal result. And the best way you can do it is by introducing neurodiversity. Rather it be Down syndrome.
Can I just interject that introducing neurodiversity is a suboptimal.
This is the key. This is the key. The way that you effectively avoid game theory dilemmas is through something quote unquote suboptimal, which the game theory formulation would never tell you to do. This is the problem. Game theory is now we know how to be really rational because we know the game theory. No, it should be the revelation that you need something non-rational is the language I used, or suboptimal. So let's put it this way. So let's go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay. You know how we were talking about what ends up happening is Kennedy and Khrushchev, in a sense, they brought the interiority between them personally, okay? Like between them. If you don't have a line of diplomacy, it becomes between America and the Soviet Union. So the dynamicism is now between those nations, which is an apocalypse, versus bringing it between Khrushchev and Kennedy. There's the dynamicism that can surprise you, but now you're going to contain the result. Please.
This just brings me back. So the Khrushchev-Kennedy scenario, which obviously, we say, I would like to say something beyond personalizes, but let's just say personalizes the limitation.
Yes.
And then you think about, we were talking earlier about fundamentalism. Everyone has all their eggs in the fundamentalist basket in one way to sort of mediate that fundamentalism is to have a sort of nested hierarchy of interiority. Yes. So you belong to several groups, yep, and not just one group and so on. But let's just say you belong simply to one group, and that group has fundamentalized under the pressures of a relational collapse, and you are in a hyperdynamic relationship with your exteriority, meaning you are a fundamentalist group. You are so ideologically charged, so different from your exterior that you are now in conflict with your exterior. And let's say there's another group that is likewise under the pressures of relational collapse, formed an interiority of fundamental opposition to group one. So you have group one, group two, fundamentally unaligned and in conflict. Now, one might say, well, I would like to say initially, okay, the very limitations between the two membranes two saturated membranes, and let's say the excess product is actual conflict. So they're actually at war. Preceding the war, they're in a sort of abstracted state of conflict. They haven't met. They haven't actually phenomenologically experienced the limitation of the other, meaning the real, right? So they have their own limit, the interior limit, which forms this, which entails the saturated interior, and so the fundamental collapse of relationality into a unity. But they haven't, in their exterior form, met the exterior form of the other where the other is at, right? And that may produce war. It may produce all sorts of things, all sorts of terrible things. But that conflict, given enough time and repetition, will reveal its own limit beyond which a qualitative shift occurs in the conflict. So you see this all the time. I mean, it's like almost a parody at this point. Like you see the Palestinian and the Israeli who have decided to get together in person and actually chop it up. And then they come out and they're like, you know what? We're not that different. Because we spent 16 hours going at it. And at the end of the day, we actually realized that we share a bit of interiority. We've actually maybe even created a bit of interiority through the conflict because we surpassed a given threshold of interaction in actuality, not the abstracted actuality of limitations, wherein which you have simply the schematic representation of other with which to interact with, which in some ways is virtual interaction, I would like to pose. But when you have actual interaction, and even, by the way, the virtual interaction, if you were to virtually interact, if a Palestinian or an Israeli, I'm just going to bring up the hot button issue of the day, were to schematically interact, meaning like in total abstract terms, with a Palestinian, in excess of the schematization, the schematized category of Palestinian, they would end up with a Daniel. They would end up with an absolute indeterminate object that was no longer Palestinian, though the word Palestinian still applied. The Palestinian would transcend its determinate form and become indeterminate and thereby represent potentiality. And suddenly, how do you then grapple with this thing that was formerly your determinate opposition, which is now an indeterminate potentiality, and you realize doesn't fit in neatly to the category you had them baked into? So you can confront in abstract terms an other, an object, in abstract terms, non-real terms, in such repetition and saturation and dedication, that the very category of that other sublates into an indeterminate form that is unschematizable, and thereby, on the far side of that indeterminacy, can come out in any rhizomatic array of ways, which means you have to then reconsider who this person is, because suddenly they do not neatly fit into your category of oppositional object. So, just to say and put a pin on that, abstract sublation of other is possible. It's just not done very often. We don't tend to think of our enemy in meditative ways, in mantra ways. We don't tend to think about them enough. There isn't enough thought of our opposition. Because if there were, we would reach a limit beyond which our opposition would no longer represent our opposition.
Yes. Yes.
Likewise, I think that's more difficult in abstract terms, because you have to convince people of a thought process that is very meditative and curious to the cognitive process. When we meet in real terms, when Khrushchev and Kennedy meet in real terms, I think that process is greatly accelerated, because the limitations are suddenly subject to the undistanced commune, whereby the very limits of schematic organization are threatened by proximity itself. Well, suddenly you're now environmentally proximate to this thing that seems so schematically distant. And so I think that's the great advantage of spatiotemporal relation. And one of the great things we're missing in the age of the internet is that when you engage in spatiotemporal relationality or relationalism, the very proximity of the other invades the prior distance of the schematic othering.
Outstanding. So, a few things. First, I think what you were describing with the virtual and the imaginative is one of the reasons why people associate art literature with empathy. Like, if you learn art, it's just very, very rare to encounter great art or great music that would create that empathy. And usually the art that creates empathy is with people that are similar to you, not radically different. But there's something about art, if people actually engage with it, which would make them, suddenly the Palestinian becomes Daniel. And you're like, oh, there's an excess, so I need to be open. So art can do this. It just doesn't easily. It has to be truly a great work. Speaking of nuclear, it's like the Day After Tomorrow movie that came out in the 80s that like Reagan watched, that came out, it was that movie of the nuclear apocalypse between the Soviets, that radically transformed world frickin' history, a piece of art. And you get you can go through history and see these novels or these paintings that come out that literally lead to pretty radical transformation. And it's actually to this point, Hannah More, who is a great abolitionist, Fiery Convictions, great biography by Karen Pryor. She was almost married Samuel Johnson. She was big on ending slavery, the slave trade. And one of the things that she said is that it is not imagination changes the world. It is imagination, not rationality. And what she was saying is that it's empathy, emotion. Imagination can have an emotional transformation in people that greatly increases the probability. Like if you're looking for a rational reason to end the slave trade, you never will, because it makes money and stuff, right? But if you imagine a world without the slave trade, things can change, right? And so what she's pointing at is basically the way she's using imagination is basically as you were describing, the virtual and the abstract. But again, this is where freak theory is a big deal, because it provides a schema of that mechanism. And so here's the thing. The other thing I was going to say before I forget is that you're exactly right with the internet and the socio-temporal connection, geography increases it. The question is the following. We all know it is impossible for everyone on planet Earth to visit every country and interact with everyone, right? So we've got a major problem right there. Can Zoom deal with the problem better than Instagram and YouTube?
Absolutely. I was just going to say, Absolutely. I think that spatiotemporality is not is like translocal.
Yes.
It's
Yep.
translocalized.
Yep.
And this is borne out obviously in notions like entanglement and so on. But the phenomenology of sharing the same spatiotemporal world transcends geography.
Yep. Yep.
That is my experience, but it also, I think, is borne out if we want to get fancy with physics. And I was just imagining, like, if somehow, I think asynchronous communication does not help the issue. I think asynchronous communication is great for contemplation. And I love communicating with you, for instance, asynchronously. And I love email chains and so on, because I want interior privacy. I want a moment of internal privacy to digest and incubate in my own sort of lacuna and then come back, right? So that's great, but it doesn't do what this does,
right?
And it's a very different experience being in a synchronized communication than an asynchronous one. And I do think that if Zoom were more pop culturally sort of instituted in fucking, if we had more synchronous communication, more synchronous social apps, social media, Jesus, brain dead, social media, then I think that some of these problems would actually would disappear because this experience transcends locality. So yes, and I was just going to say, I just wanted to chime in and say yes, because while we're talking on Zoom, I'm experiencing being with you. In fact, the thing on the net that I led with way, at the beginning of this conversation was that sort of relational collapse is only possible in synchronous terms.
Yep.
And there it was, and it was on Zoom. Yeah.
No, 100%. And just as a note, like a big thing of belonging again for me is we had the oral tradition, we had the writing tradition, and I think we have something like a Zoom tradition that is now possible. What's so interesting about Zoom is it's a return to oral, but you can record it. Where writing is recording, right? You can record and you can think. Zoom allows some sort of negation, sublation of those. And I think basically Zoom is a necessary component infrastructurally of the problem of global pluralism not leading to disaster. Because all you have to do, it's another topic. Right now, education trains you to think that a good use of like learning is basically trivia, knowing random questions to the teacher or worksheets. You have to get back to oral education and think about education as really being much more on the terms of rhetoric and employing things like Zoom to communicate not with the teacher at the classroom, but with people around the world. If like right now you have a lot of, because a lot of the people who say that are called woke, they make a lot of really important points about diversity and difference in different things. The issue is that you can't do that through law or threats or creating a new us versus them. If you want to make space, if you will, or connect with diversity, you need to do it with something like Zoom. But that's really hard. But if you go through history and you see like the Kennedy and Khrushchev episode Diplomacy, and then you go to the Great Enrichment of Dietrich McCloskey, you see that basically the ability of human beings to share in communication makes an insane difference. And it basically would seem as if this kind of technology, which allows the possibility, not necessarily easily, but maybe if we were to socially emphasize it, allows the possibility of everyday people to interact and humanize great diversity. But this is where also the philosopher is important, because how do you keep that conversation from just being small talk? or hurting people's feelings. Well, this is where the philosopher comes in and says, how do we talk about difference in a way that doesn't hurt one another or that we find inspiring? There is a way of talking that is necessary for diversity. And we got into this a bit with the, so for example, the philosopher's in the business of noting when there's presuppositions, right? And deconstructing them. Presuppositions always get in the way of diversity. They always get in the way of very different people. Well, let me deconstruct your presuppositions, but how do I do it to where that doesn't make you a nihilist, right? How do I deconstruct your presuppositions, show you that we need to stay on the path, but not make you think that there is nothing that we're heading toward? This is a surgical art form of showing people that there's an assumption, but that doesn't mean there isn't such thing as truth, dare I say, or the ability to condition yourself. This is surgical. And this is where the philosopher, I think, has a very big role in sort of being an agent of this freeing of speech, I've almost called it, versus kind of a free speech. This freeing of speech, which seems tied to a net tradition, that then if we look at a Jonathan Rauch, is free speech is tied to the ability of knowledge acquisition. We look at a Kuhn with the scientific revolution. I can go on. The ability of people to exchange information allows for an interiority to be created that's more like the band than it is, between it. Because here's a key point. We were talking unknown unknowns, that makes me think of Black Swan. Nassim also talks about skin in the game. But here's the key. If Kirchhoff and Kennedy talk, then the skin is the game is between them personally, as politicians and as people. If they refuse the skin of the game and cut down communication, the skin in the game is between America and the Soviet Union. It moves up the scale, if you will. So if you can keep through meta-decentralization, if you will, that I think something like the net, the Zoom makes possible, then you locate the skin in the game between individuals so it doesn't move to a large scale that if a mistake happens, it's so big it tears down the whole thing. Like the key to the decentralization is the notion that if there's a mistake or something goes wrong, the damage is centralized, right? is contained. It's not so big. Well, that's what basically Kennedy and Kirchhoff are doing. They're like, yeah, if the American people find out I'm talking with Kirchhoff, I'm going to get voted out of office, but I'm going to do it. And Kirchhoff's like, yeah, I'm not supposed to talk with these guys, but I'm going to do it. So they're taking on major risk, right? And so here's the key. And before I forget, so game theory, philosophy seems to have a role of locating Nash equilibria or game theory problems. They say, here's a problem where rationality cannot help you because there are false Nash equilibrium or manufactured ones and real ones or paradoxes in the way we're describing, right? Some things that seem like rationality can't help you, actually rationality could help you. This isn't the time for intuition. And this is where Hegel comes in and says, no, you need to conceptually mediate. So the philosopher can go, no. This isn't the time to talk about your feelings or your imagination. We need rationality here. This is a false Nash equilibria, limiting the intuition, if you will. But then the philosopher goes, no, this is a real one. This is where rationality can't help us. And if everyone's a rational agent, we're in problem. So then the philosopher says, you know what we need? We need surprise. We need to bring two people relating to have skin in the game. They locating a Nash equilibria should not be a notion of, oh, this is how we be more rational. No, it should mean we need to add some surprise. We need to add some encounter. The skin in the game is located on too large of a scale. It needs to be personalized more or brought down to a smaller level. Because without that, the philosopher in a way can add the neurodiversity, quote unquote, the different ways of thinking, the menti-divergence, as I've called it in the book, to help the political or the theoretician from ending up in a situation where you're going to lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the philosopher then is perpetually in this business of limiting. But they're they're always checking our balance to assume we know where there's a Nash equilibria. And they're also checking and balancing us from believing that rationality is all that we need. So there's this perpetual limiting role that the philosopher has. And in doing that, then the philosopher is like, oh, we got to bring in some imagination. Oh, Kennedy, hey, there must not be enough relating. There must not be enough possibility of surprise. To me, game theory shows you that there's not enough surprise here, which is ironic because the whole idea of it is we've encountered a limit where we don't know what we know, but then it's no longer a surprise, actually. You've gotten rid of the encounterology because now you know it, and the philosopher is the one that can say, hey, you've actually, in your understanding of the limits of rationality, fallen back into the understanding. You've fallen back from the dialectic into rationality, and you can't do that. And here's the issue. Philosophy may always have a role as such a person, because the more complex the society, the greater the diversity, the more Nash equilibria that could appear, or the more limitations to rationality could occur. Because diversity is always something that can only be fully disclosed to you in what? The encounter, in the relation, in the surprise. Otherwise, the Hindu is the idea of a Hindu versus John or Manya or whatever, right? So there's always, diversity always introduces limitations to rationality that the philosopher's like, yep, you got to do the work of the subject. You got to get in there. And to me, if we think about, and then I'll give it back to you, it's like, for me, thinking about limit as central, like freak theory does, really helps go through like so many philosophical quandaries. And to think like, so for example, how do you cross the, and we were speaking about, how do we cross the divide between the word tree and the phenomenon of tree, right? Like, how do you ever know that the word tree means the thing? Well, the word tree actually designates a limit. When I say to you, this is a tree, you know there's a limited range of possible experience. You're not going to experience a fluffy tail, for example, right? You're limited from knowing the exact details, but words designate a limit. That's why they're meaningful. What we've done is said words are meaningful because they designate things. Well, that gives you all of the Derrida problems. No, they designate a limit of the possible experience that you could have. And also they designate a limit of what you can know outside of encounter, because all you can know is the word. If you really want to know the signified, you got to go encounter it. But the word at the same time designates a limit to the kind of phenomenon that you might encounter. Likewise with the ship of Theseus, you know, you take a board out, when does it stop being a ship, right? You know, you take one board, it's still a ship. You take another, it stops being a ship. There's a certain limit that you hit and it stops being a ship, right? But you see, for most of history, we've approached paradoxes. Paradoxes are the revelation of limits, not of things. You can't deal with paradox when you think things, right? And since philosophy has mostly for history been in the business of things or nothing, no thing, it hasn't been able to deal with these various paradoxes. But if actually we say no, the paradoxes of philosophy emerge, or the game theory paradoxes of the Kenneth Arrow, say public choice or whatever, they emerge precisely when a limitation appears. And there is no way to address a limitation outside encounter, like you said, right? So this is why the paradoxes are there. You can't deal with something that needs a limitation by thinking the limit. You have to go into the limit and encounter the limit. You can't know when the ship of Theseus stops being a ship unless you encounter the ship that you're tearing apart. You have to go and take it apart, and then you'll see, yeah, it's not a ship anymore. I can see that. It's not a ship. Or when I say that's a tree, you say, yep, that's a tree. I can see it. I'm encountering it. It doesn't have a fluffy tail. So limit then becomes a kind of skeleton key to deal with all of these different paradoxes. And I think it also functions as a, and then I'll give it back to you, and I don't know where the time goes. It's lovely to speak with you. It functions as a skeleton key to also think about the game theory problems, to think about the behavioral sink, the rat utopia, the stimulating demand versus creating demand. All of these things are a product of trying to think limitation, or to how do we deal with the problem of scarcity, right? That seems like it's confronting limit. It seems like it is, but no, because it's outside the encounter. It's the idea of scarcity. And then Ivan Illich tells you that, well, that poses a problem because then economics creates scarcity to stimulate its own demand. Because it ceases to encounter it, it actually needs to have intentional obsolescence or limiting the availability of assets. It has to create limits. So here's the irony. In economics, if you don't encounter limit, you create limit. Oh, that doesn't sound good, because that's a false limit. And the philosopher shows up and says, nah, that's a manufactured limit. That's a manufactured scarcity. That's not a real one. Just like you were saying, the difference between the encounter historic limitation or forcing function versus the manufactured one. And so the philosopher perpetually has this kind of role as an agent of identifying the manufactured limit from the real limit. Wow, it almost sounds like we're talking about the noumenon and the phenomenon now, right? Because that's kind of that was an intuition getting at the thing, but it's the issue is that the limit is the noumenal, right? Like it's the phenomenal noumenal. So you're identifying the real one in experience as opposed to the manufactured one in experience. I throw it back to you.
Yeah, just a couple thoughts. You know, the idea of tree is not a fluffy tail, and you have the limit you're delimiting tree, the word tree, to suggest an array of aesthetic possibility within a given limit. But if I do show you a tree and I say that's tree, and you look and it is a fluffy tail, and I insist that that's a tree, and you allow that, okay, perhaps this prediction error needs to be assimilated as tree. That's art.
Yes, yes.
That's basically what art is. And so the process of being an artist is essentially to produce excess products.
Yep.
Every product of art, the true art, is ideally in excess of some schema that requires that the user of the art or that the audience accommodate this prediction error as into a schema that was otherwise not set up for that object. And that's the experience of newness, accommodation. Like, oh, okay, different kind of orange. Oh, okay, different kind of bicycle. Oh, okay, different kind of tree. Oh, okay, a goat man. Interesting. Right? And so you have these combinatorial possibilities that are previously in excess of your schematization, and the excess product is the piece of art itself, if it's going to affect you in such a way that you're like, ah, that's new, that's interesting, and so on. I guess I'd push back a little bit on the idea that the encounter again with limit must be actual. Again, there is the problem of semantic satiation, which is able to, in total abstract terms, produce the indeterminate object out of the formerly determinate object by saturating the category of that object and creating a relational collapse, meaning a new interiority within the schematic general container of interiority. And you know, this is like the idea of Osho saying, well, if you want to get out of pain, you repeat the idea of the pain. You don't have to go do the pain over and over again. You just imagine the pain over and over and over and over and over again. Saturate yourself, collapse that saturation, make it indeterminate, thereby make it absent. Or, put in other terms, non-dynamical, and a return to potential. Repotentiate that experience so that you can make something new out of it. It's a creative act. There's so much, the conversation of limit because of everything I just said keeps going in the sense that it's sort of inherently unlimited. But I like what you were saying in terms of, I guess the last thing I'll say is just in terms of the role of the philosopher in identifying, essentially, I mean, what Nash equilibria would be is in real life terms, are a set of subjective objects, a set of interiorities, a set of differential objects, each, a subject in their own right, knowing the viewpoints, the fundamentalist set viewpoints of the others, knowing that their viewpoints would be in conflict with their own, and nevertheless refusing to change on any level. And a stasis of differentials, a stasis of difference, an unwillingness to engage in dynamic interplay which may sublate and create a unified interiority amongst the differential objects or the enemies, and thereby create an equilibrium of hostility. A stasis of hostility, and or just a stasis, a 0 point, a stasis of internality, which has reached, behavioral sink levels. And therefore, the job of the philosopher is almost identical to the job of the artist, which is to produce the excess product, which itself represents and awakens us to an exteriority which must be assimilated in the very process of accommodating a prediction error, wakes us up to the dynamic interplay of ourselves and our interiority and our world being part of a larger world. So that every time an excess product is produced, we are awakened, just like a couple completely smitten and part of an interiority producing a child that disrupts the interiority, produces the awakeness of that realization of an exteriority, that realization of a dynamic interplay, that realization that the moment of equilibrium of internality was but a moment that is, while in its continuity, eternalized as one of the foundational stratas of your life, ongoing, eternal, stasis, inert, and thereby having inertia and never ending, and now forms the ground, the cross-section of sediment of the layers of your very life of processual development, is nevertheless now not actual anymore. It is a former actuality. It is now a historical actuality that has disappeared under its own fulfillment, and fulfillment as in its own saturated state, its own ubiquity. It has saturated your life and thereby gone absent, and now you have this excess product. And it forms the backdrop, the negativity against which the new dynamism occurs. And so the activity of philosophy for me, as a philosopher, is to constantly reproduce at the moment my own excess product, which is eventually going to be, I was just telling my fiance about this, eventually it's going to be inert to me, everything we're talking about. Eventually, I'm going to saturate this topic, and I'm going to run in to a limitation beyond which this topic will simply become an inert unity carrying itself on with its inertia as an invisible sedimentary layer of my life that simply is a given. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not subject to reinterpretation or that it doesn't get invaded by environmental changes which produce prediction errors or problematize the prior concreteness of that saturation, but that any subsequent dynamic interactions or interplays with that saturated philosophy are not re-investigations, but subsequent dynamic interplays which produce yet another strata of saturation, which is all to say that if I'm going to be a good philosopher, I'm going to always embrace that artistic excess which boots me out of the safety of the interiority I've been working so hard to generate. And as an excess product myself, out there in the abyss of exteriority, saying, look at me. I'm no longer within the interiority from whence I came. And I am now developing this new interiority that is not yet interior, with all these now external objects, which I am coalescing, these thoughts, these concepts, which I am now coalescing. And that very act of being an excess product within my own external experience, self-alienated from my former interiority, is of course an act of courage, an act of the permissionary, and the act of the artist at the end of the day, where that behavior, that activity requires new schematization and thereby requires growth and processual development, which at the end of the day, despite us always yearning for this static state in which we almost experience, the apotheosis of development, and thereby the stasis of development, and thereby the cessation of development, we could always do with a little more development, right? And so we must make excess products of ourselves, not simply look at the excess product that is being created, but make excess products of ourselves, to constantly throw ourselves, to work so hard at our philosophies that we are eventually self-alienated from them, that they become products, excess products in the world that then we can relate dynamically to, and then sublate again, meaning every time we come up with a finalization, an apotheosis of our philosophy, that very, like I was saying to you before, belonging again has now become this product that you can now interact with dynamically. You saturate it to the point where you're like, okay, I'm ready to birth. This product is now, these thoughts are now in excess of my capacity to contain them. They are now going to be externalized as the excess product of my machinations. Now I interact dynamically with that product, sublate that philosophy into a qualitatively new one, a new interiority, which then will saturate and produce yet another excess product. And each time those excess products occur, we're kind of blowing up the fruit of our labor to create a new fruit, or a next developmental stage of the fruiting body. So anyway, just rambling at that point, but it's been wonderful exploring this topic again with you. And again, I can tell this is already going to be one of those, when I transcribe it, or have it transcribed, I should say, that is going to be a real gold mine for the eventual saturation of my own philosophy and the putting out of my own excess product as book.
Divine. Well, I've enjoyed this immensely, and I will see if the children will eat the chicken sandwiches. So we will see. There's no telling. But a few things. Everything you just said was stunning and beautiful. And to me, that was a wonderful description of what I think Hegel is getting at on this notion of kind of the philosophers to reconcile themselves with the future and the kind of openness, because everything you just said was a kind of thought, a kind of, if we were talking the possibility, potential, like right now you have actuality and there's a certain possibility that is being considered of how things could unfold, that if they unfold, you are reconciled to them doing so, and thus you can find belonging in it. And yet you could not predict it. And that to me is getting what it must mean to belong again, without it being naive or problematic. There is something about finding belonging in that reconciliation to everything that you just said, that in it entails saturation, alienation, dynamism. It's going and going and going, but that is what we have to find belonging in, per se, which of course is very odd because it sounds like one giant process that would keep you from belonging. But this is the funny thing. No, it's just It's actually coming to terms with it and reconciling yourself to it. And this is where I also think that, like you were saying, the free will, determinism debate, those languages, there's some problems there, because actually that alignment and reconciliation with this almost deterministic process is actually where freedom is found. Like you align with this thing that is unfolding, that has a certain determination, like the determination is that you need limit. And then you say, yes, I find freedom, I reconcile with that. And thus there is freedom and limit because it becomes limitless. And thus that kind of shatters the simplistic free will deterministic debate. But again, this is where limit is a big deal. I also really liked what you were saying about the artist of philosophy. You know, one way I guess I think about it, you know, Hegel talks about art, philosophy, and religion. There's a way where the philosopher has the job of saying, that's a manufactured limit, but that's a real limit. And then the artist says, oh, that's a real limit. Let me go in and make it limitless. And then the religion is binding yourself to that process. The religion is, okay, I'm going to let the artist go make that real limit limitless now. I guess I'll have to keep working as a philosopher. Stupid artist. But you know, I'm glad they made it limitless because then that keeps the unfolding of the absolute, right? And the religion is coming to reconcile, binding, religio, binding yourself to the philosopher, finding the real limit that the artist says, okay, let me get in there and make it limitless. And you bind yourself to all of that, and you allow things to unfold accordingly. Your point is well taken on the notion that you can satirize the thought, and there's a limit in that. You know, to me, that's just right to Hegel, right? Like self-sense, you saturate the thought, but then you say, oh, I have control over the ability to self-saturate my thoughts. So it ceases to be a limit, but then that pushes you out to the next dynamicism. So there's a limit, you encounter a limit, but then you control the limit because you control your thought. So then it ceases to be a limit, but then that pushes you out to the next limit of, you know, the self-consciousness, consciousness, you know, reason, blah, blah, blah. And so I think that's well taken. And that just goes to show you how every single limit, as soon as you hit it, then actually becomes something that you can claim control over, and then it ceases to function limitation. So to clarify, I would say you have to encounter per se internally the saturation point of thoughts overwhelming themselves. So you encounter your own thoughts being able to sustain themselves. Well, now that you've encountered that, it's no longer a limit. So now you need the new encounter, which is the other, and the new encounter, and there's an ever encounterology. And the problem with game theory is the first time it emerges, it's an encounter and good, and it's a kind of historic development. But then if it stays there and doesn't, from the game theory as a schema, as an intellectual exercise, if it doesn't move from that to a new limitation of rationality, then it self-effaces, right? Like, to use my language, there's always this idea in Hegel that you have to encounter the limit, now move to the next encounter, move to the, well, that's where the artist and the artist is like, hey, philosopher, you just found a limit. Haha, let me run in and make it limitless now. So there's a new encounter and a new encounter and a new encounter. And so, and to me, and then to all of that, my argument would be that everything you said so beautifully, that is a structure of the subject following freak theory that until economics makes central to its thinking, until politics, sociology, and all of these things thinks this way about the subject, you cannot deal with the behavioral sync problem. You cannot deal with the rat utopia. You cannot deal with the great stagnation. Because what you are describing so well would be an example of negentropy, basically creating demand. You're always going. Well, now we have a capitalism that doesn't have to be so auto-cannibalistic. It doesn't have to create scarcity because it can actually create its own drive. But the key is that drive is conditional. Just like you said, at the rat utopia, we see it could go away. And for too long, economics has said, no, it can't, just stimulate it. Just stimulate it. And you're stimulating a dead body. That's what happened. It's like, stimulate those mice. They're eating each other. And basically, of course, the horror in an economic model that can only stimulate demand, you can't avoid a Cuban Missile Crisis. It's just a matter of time before that occurs. And so, and then lastly, to me, you know, you were making the tremendous, this idea of that's the stimulation, right? Something outside. But then when you come to terms in an intimate relationship, there's a kind of, saturation there, right? That comes together, indeterminacy. So what would it mean to maintain, what can create kind of drive, if you will, without having to upset this state of saturation? That seems to have a certain piece to it, right? Well, this is where things like beauty is such a big deal, because beauty can attract you toward it, attract you into action without having to upset your intimate relationship. You both can experience the beauty, right? Whereas if it's envy or consumerism, well, or fame, well, then that could require a certain needing to disrupt your internal state. So what can create drive without disrupting the internal state? Because if we can't think that, and it would have to be external from you, right? Because that's the only place the dynamicism could be located. If we cannot think this, then we have no way to deal with the problem of drive going into the rat utopia or something like that. There's something here about beauty, because beauty is external from you and it can attract you without upsetting your internal. In fact, it may elevate an internal saturation, or this dynamicism is something that you can, in a saturation, participate in. And then the question becomes, and this is where I think the artist is central here, because the artist has an ability to think the possibility of creating dynamicism without upsetting internal states, because they can create something external to you that sort of attracts you in different things. And this, of course, because one never escapes Plato, brings one back to these kind of classical, or the absolute idea in Hegel. So, and then ultimately what this would mean, this would suggest that basically economics without beauty is doomed. This would suggest that beauty as a concept is necessary philosophy, that there's something about beauty able to create a dynamicism that doesn't need to necessarily disrupt the internal. Now, it depends on what we mean by disrupt, because what if you're inspired? Now you, in a way, have seen something and it's glimpsed and it's gone, you want to get it again. So there's a question of the kind of way that it disrupts you. But it's interesting to think that if it does disrupt, and this is an open question because I have to write, with Jockin and talking with him on the fate of beauty is the fate of us. It seems to me, though, and I'd be curious what you think about this. It seems to me beauty can introduce a new dynamicism that does maybe create a new kind of drive inside of you, but it doesn't have to disrupt the previous indeterminacy that you've arrived at. Like, it doesn't have to disrupt your relationship. Now, maybe it can, but it's interesting to think that there's something about beauty that allows a qualitative change without necessarily having to disrupt your internal state, or at least your current. It's like the sublative move. It has this move of kind of pushing you without necessarily having to destroy. I'd be curious. That's a very open subject, but I just think a lot about beauty as this dealing with this problem of the rat utopia.
So I would say that beauty is the encounter with a resonant indeterminacy. Beauty, I think, is indeterminate, and it is an indeterminacy that it's sort of the difference between what is awful and awesome. Beauty is in excess of schematization. Beauty is not schematizable. If it were schematizable, it would lose its aura. I think that beauty has an indeterminate aura, and that's what makes something beautiful. It is somehow ineffable. It is somehow refuses the schematization of language. Yeah. And in that sense, beauty is an encounter with the real that, instead of traumatizing you, resonates and enlarges the sensation of indeterminacy within you, thereby reminding you, in a certain sense, of your own ineffable, indeterminate, saturated state. And yet, the beauty is internally alien to you. There is an isomorphism between your own interiority and it. There is an equivalency, but that equivalency does not conjoin. It remains alien because it is unschematizable. But what it does do is resonate in a certain harmony. with your indeterminacy precisely and mathematically, because one indeterminacy is mathematically isomorphic to another, just as one infinity is equivalent to another. And so there's something about the encounter with beauty that allows us to experience an exteriority as an interiority. Or as resonant with an interiority, with our interiority. And yet remain alien and unschematized. And of course, the great foible is to attempt to schematize beauty, which of course pops the indeterminate air and creates determinations which erode the moment of beauty. I'm sure we've all experienced watching a sunset with our lover or having an otherwise beautiful experience with someone. And then we make the great error of saying, isn't this magnificent? Boy, this is beautiful, huh? And we collapse it into a schematic category. And all of a sudden we notice that that sensation, that aura, also collapses. But before we make that terrible error, which we compulsively make, we experience this resonant, oh my God, this thing is what I am. It's reminding me of what I am, and it can remind us of our own singular indeterminacy, which is qualitatively unique and yet quantitatively identical to it, because it is indeterminate and so isomorphic to any other indeterminacy. So I think beauty is very important, because what it essentially does is puts two phenomenological infinities or indeterminacies in relation to one another against within a world of exteriority, so that you suddenly feel co-resonant. And it's a great feeling, and I think it's quite important to experience that. And in a lot of ways, we do get to experience that when we exceed limitations or saturate our limitations of difference with others. We get to experience like a moment of co-resonation that transcends the categorical differences between us. And those are the moments that, you know, philosophers and idealists and naive politicians have relied on for years to stir the emotions and the hopes and dreams of people toward a world that is more co-resonant. Imagine all the people. And of course, we can call it naive, but it is based in a phenomenological reality that we've all experienced. And that's why, despite its naiveness, it is a lasting and rather philosophically substantial position, which is that one of the possibilities always present is co-resonance in any given conflict. There is always the possibility. And so we can never really fully write that off without then being intentionally, willfully ignorant of that possibility. So anyhow, yeah.
That was magnificent, and I really like what you had to say there. And, you know, I suppose to close, as you were speaking, so basically what I would say, if freak theory describes the subject and, dare I say, reality, then there would be reason to think that beauty has the function like you described, which would then mean that it is possible to avoid the rat utopia. If you could figure out how to create the conditions of possibility for that to be so underwent by the average subject, which would require classroom reform, consumer, et cetera, so forth. But if this is all so, then it is not the case that game A, say, to use that very general term, it is not the case that game A must eat itself. Maybe it's highly likely, or maybe it's highly likely without a historic forcing function, like we were saying. But all of this would suggest the possibility of the conditions of possibility already being present in game A, that if realized, could move it towards something like AB or non-auto-cannibalistic, et cetera, so forth. So to me, these are the kind of stakes. Freak theory plus beauty means game A doesn't have to be rat utopia. Maybe there's a high chance of it, but not necessarily. And then what is the role of the philosopher or the average person or people like us that doesn't become philosopher kings trying to tell everyone they're stupid if they don't change, but also participates in these conditions possibility while reconciled to having to just be participating in that system, but not passive, because that seems to be the best you can do, right? Like where you're not trying to be the central planner designing everything, but you also are in a sense showing the alternative way for the subject to operate. Well, that if that attracts people to a difference, there you go. Please, Alex.
I'm just going to say that, you know, just to bring in Deleuze, because I told you I was reading some of Oedipus.
Nice.
So the socius, or the body without organs in the political context, as being basically the sublated state, the super freak, the relational collapse, under which the various organs of a given machine essentially converge upon uniformity in terms of their dynamic interaction. They break down, and you end up with a body without organs, which is, again, this non-dynamical interiority, and in the context of politics, calling it the socius. The idea is that any transgression against this convergence upon the body without organs, upon the sublated collapse of relationality, is going to be violently put down, because the very process, in line with the notion of the death drive or the static drive, which I think is more appropriate even in this case, wants to converge upon that indeterminate interior collapse of relationality. It wants to be a body without organs. It wants to be a sublated collapse of relationality that exists in that indeterminate, static, inert state. So they have the almost identical, you know, again, freak theory maps perfectly over this. And I only bring that up to say that when we try and come up with ways to, like, for instance, what is socialism? Socialism is basically a move to retard that convergence, right? We put in preemptive parameters, preemptive limitations on the activity of capitalism to retard the convergence of capitalistic behavior into the body without organs, into the socius, into the sort of collapse of relationality that would spell sort of the equilibrium that we would think of as economic disaster. But let's just say, for instance, that it's the case that all of those moves are simply retardations of an otherwise inexorable convergence upon equilibrium, just like thermodynamics predicts, right? Well then, the idea would be how to accelerate the process or modulate that convergence in such a way that it minimizes deleterious effects of that convergence and maximizes the potential determinate outcomes that occur as the excess products on the far side of that saturation. So one of the things that I think of when we talk about, like, what is the philosopher's role? Largely the philosopher's role may be to simply educate the people involved in that convergence preemptive of that desolate equilibrium, such that we are ensuring that the determinate outcome on the far side of that indeterminate collapse is most likely to be something informed by the very educative processes which occurred preemptive of that indeterminate collapse. So that we're seeding people with ideas that will not come about now, but that will be the very rhizomatic seeds that sprout on the far side of that collapse into indeterminacy, which is itself a collapse into potentiality, so that we can stack the deck of that potentiality such that the outcomes, the determinate outcomes on the far side of it, meaning the phoenix that rises from it, has something to do with the educative process that occurred preemptive of that collapse.
What you just said is spot on. So there's a few things. You can make this case historically. You have books, To Change the World by James Hunter. You have the Theory of Sociological Change by Randall Collins, et cetera, so forth, that show that actually the world tends to be made 50 years from now by the ideas of people who were faithfully present to them. And there's a downstream, and this is sociologically documented. And then if you look at Dietrich McCloskey, who basically argues that ideas is what caused the great enrichment, dang it, the explosion of technology around the 18th century, where the average person on planet Earth goes from less than $1 a day to having freaking air conditioning. Like, this is unbelievable. It happened within a very short period of time. Now, she gives a whole trilogy for why this occurred, and there is a debate to be had between her and Carl Planier, but we'll avoid that for now. But the point is this. The world is changed by basically the process you just described. And if it's changed more, which you could call the changing of conditions of possibility via faithful presence, right? But it's very active, though, because you have to be working on your ideas, finding your limitations, and showing them to people so that the seeds are there. It's not passive at all. In fact, you're resisting the temptation to directly oppose. Because here's the problem: when you directly oppose, following your theory, you only get the change when you have the saturation point. If you accelerate it, it doesn't happen. You can accelerate the saturation, but you cannot accelerate ahead of the saturation. And that's always what occurs. And so the question is, philosophy. So here are the questions. All right, the philosopher's in the business of conditions of possibility. I'm going to call that the faithful presence. Just, that's what you said, James. It's great. There is a case for it. And it's very convincing. Faithful presence. The question is, are there things the philosopher could maybe do or support to accelerate the saturation, not accelerate ahead of the saturation? Now, I do think there are. And I'll also note to what you were saying about socialism, is that I enjoy speaking with you so much. It's a delight. So thank you, Ebert. Karatani's in the capital nation state, and I've been speaking. You can't beat the capital nation state by opposing it. But what you can do is, within it, change the conditions of possibility that transform it via a faithful presence. So Karatani in the Structures of World History is very good. And to Karl Marx's defense, this was his original understanding of how you work with the problem of capitalism. He became revolutionary, and Karatani is very good at this. Like, people started revolting, and then Marx was like, I guess I need to support this. But he himself would have preferred that not to have occurred. And Marx also was a thinker of, now, this isn't to get into the whole theory of communism, because I do have issues with the surplus value theory that he has, because but that's another issue. But to his defense, communism only works with a world revolution. This was not a slogan. This was very real. It had to be a simultaneous revolution because otherwise trade would break down and people would go to war. So he meant that. But by definition, that meant it had to be a faithful presence of changing conditions of possibility. It could not be stimulated ahead of time because a global revolution has to have this simultaneous blossoming. And then, yeah, you look back on history, that's what you see. Right? Well, that's the role of the philosopher. Can you accelerate the saturation? I think there are a few things. One, I'd like to see the spread of Zoom into the classroom. I'd like to see the removal of the trivia structure in favor of a oral tradition. The test, people are not speaking, you're not thinking. I would like to see the college monopoly on credentials break down to where people can get jobs not because they go to college, because that tends to fit the technological essence. I'd like to have reform on certification laws and various things that force you to have various forms of certification to get jobs, which then means you have to be good at trivia, and you're not really, that makes you in service of the capital nation state. Some of the stuff with Ivan Illich on disablement. There are things that I think can be done that improves the flow of speaking, basically, because speaking is the saturation. That is the process of saturation for human subjects, because human subjectivity is structured by speech. We learn this in Lacan, we learn this in McCloskey, we learn this in Adorno, Farquhar, and Herbert Marcuse. Speaking makes us. But that's also why this is the key. You mentioned Deleuze. And I think we mentioned this last time. So in the theory of Deleuze, where he's countering Freud, he's like, if you look at the kid, they're very creative, right? Like the kid, the child seems to have what they need to leave Plato's cave on their own. They're very creative. They're just active. They just on their own will be like, what the frick is back there? And they'll just leave. Like it seems like boredom and beauty tend to be the things that make you able to leave the cave on your own. You get bored of being there. Well, also, I would associate beauty with fun, creativity, and possibility because you're attracted to something, right? Well, a kid has that. Well, what ends up happening that I think maybe like once you encounter the other and they traumatize you, then you slip into the Lacan, the lack, right? But we talked about how if you can work through that, you can get back to the childlikeness if you integrate with that lack and see it as an effect of a finite frame with an excess. And that's where you return to something that's creative, right? Well, this would be the movement from a speaking that makes you on the side of not being the child, a speaking that's structured like the discourse of the Frankfurt School that leads you into Kafka and control of the capital nation state. But if you can learn to engage in speaking, that can actually return you to the Deleuzian childlikeness, not by avoiding lack, but speaking the lack through the lack, which is the structure that is apparent in freak theory. You are literally speaking the freak theory into the structure of your subjectivity. Well, this is exactly then what allows the possibility of creating this change of conditions of possibility that can actually change things, right? But that increases dramatically by, say, increasing, by providing the infrastructure in the classroom. Because here's the trick to the classroom. If you go to school and the medium of the school says that a smart person is good at trivia or tests or writing, you would never think of speaking as being the process of development or learning. The classroom indirectly teaches you in a kind of William Ong or medium is the message, Marshall McLuhan sense, and this is what Neil Postman says, the classroom teaches you that to learn is to be good at memorization. Well, what does memorization mean? You're never surprised. This is the problem. We're speaking so much about the encounter of limit being the development of the subject to get to the Deleuzian childlikeness that's not the cheap to lose, but the costly to lose, as I talk about in the book, that's necessary for the creation of demand to avoid the rat utopia. Because all of school is telling you that if you're a responsible, practical person, you never encounter limit. In fact, you have a plan for the future. You know all the answers ahead of time. You never encounter stupidity, per se. Well, under those paradigms, then it's going to be much slower to accelerate, to bring about the saturation of the conditions of possibility as we were describing that would lead to a change of the subject, right? So I do think it's a longer, I do think there are laws. I think there are laws in terms of intellectual property rights. I think there are, I could go on. I do think there are here's the key. I think there are particular legislative things that you can work on that would actually help with this. But the problem is the philosopher is usually in the business of the whole system, not some unsexy law. Like, who wants to talk about the Dow versus the 1970 Supreme Court case that made employment testing illegal? No one wants to talk about that. We want to talk about, you know, the network state. Not that I'm bashing on the network state, but we're very big. You know, that's what we tend to do. But there are particular things that you could home in on that actually would increase the flow of information or flow of talking that actually could then accelerate the saturation versus accelerate ahead of the saturation. But that's not what we tend to think, because it's kind of unsexy. It's not really sexy to talk about particular laws or things like that, right? But that's actually where I think there's a big deal. And I think doing that, then what it means is that the philosopher has a role of perhaps adding menti-divergency or neurodiversity, something. I don't use neurodiversity because that sounds like appropriation to a degree, but the ability to think according to freq theory can spread that. Those can be the seeds that are spread. And it's kind of like, the problem is, like, a lot of more liberal-minded people will say the answer is education. You know, education will save us, right? The problem is it's kind of similar to the game theory issue, where if by education, though, you mean avoiding limit or having the right content, then no, it's actually going to be part of the problem. So right now, the education that's being spread that's supposed to save democracy actually does not develop the subject in the way that we're saying is necessary according to freq theory and all these other things. In fact, education, just like game theory, is leading to the illusion that more rationality is the way. Gamifying limitation, gamifying ignorance, gamifying the unknown. That's how you're going to do it. No, we need to encounter it, and to be the kind of subject who can handle encountering it. So the problem is, right now, education, just like game theory, contributes to the problem in some respects. So you have to change what exactly it does, what it teaches. But the critical thing that you're changing what it teaches is the medium of education, not just the content, because speech is fundamentally an encounter of surprise. It's fundamentally an encounter of unknown, especially when you're engaging with the philosophical and working through those things. And now you're conditioning the subject to be able to handle that kind of thing. So to me, these become the roles of the philosopher. And then at the end, to bring it to a close, and I'll give it to you for any final things. I said we were going to go and then spoke another hour because you're great. And so it's almost like we look at, like, I look at Aristotle with the four causes, right? Yeah, the first cause, the first cause, then the efficient, the material, and the final. All of this is hard to think unless we think limit. Limit is the first cause. You encounter limit, and that's what gets you going, right? And then the efficient cause and the material cause are the manifestations and practical implications of that limit. But the final cause is the isomorphic beauty that is limiting, but it doesn't traumatize, it resonates with you, right? So you have the encounter in the cave of the first cause, limitation, boredom, saturation, that then you have the efficient cause, or material cause, those kind of go together. You say, well, I'm in a cave, this is boring, I want to go. And then you turn to see the light, and you're like, I can't see up all it, but it's resonating with me, it's beautiful, and it pulls you. So we can rethink the Aristotelian four causes in terms of limit versus being or just physics. And in so doing, start thinking about the development of a subject of which can avoid the rat utopia. And to me, what you said to close on beauty as resonating versus traumatic, ultimately, to belong again, we have to belong in beauty. Belonging. There's a longing in belonging, right? To belong again, what we've tried to do is have a geographic isolationism, because we know we're limited there, right? We never leave, so we're grounded. Beauty is a limit, but it's also a call to dance. And if we can find belonging, if we can find belonging in the longing of that beauty that creates an ever dynamicism, then we have a way to continue drive without it being a source of trauma, but resonance. So I really like what you were saying about beauty as resonating to trauma. I give it back to you. I've really enjoyed this, Alex Ebert. It's been a complete delight.
It's been great. And I would just put a button on it and saying that when I was developing freq theory at the beginning, I was staring at these dynamical sonic waveforms in the studio, and I was lamenting the saturation of dynamism to the point of non-dynamic songs, vis-a-vis compression and limitation, literal compressors, literal limiters in the studio, outboard gear that compresses and limits the song, bringing the troughs up to the peaks and so on, and creating just a giant flat line of non-dynamic loudness. And I was lamenting that at first. Then I started thinking, well, there must be something to the compulsive drive toward this non-dynamical state. This non-dynamical state is relationally non-dynamical within itself. It has an interiority of non-dynamism. It is thereby confused. If you were to plop yourself inside a fully compressed song, you wouldn't be able to tell where you were. There'd be no orientating factors. There'd be no topological difference. You'd be confused. You'd be in a place of saturated ontology. Sounds like the meaning crisis. Now, the big problem, my big complaint, and this ties into everything you were just saying, of philosophers today, or the loudest philosophers today, is that the very metadialectical education that you were just talking about, wherein we get familiar with the idea of indeterminacy. We get familiar with the fact that life is a swing from confusion to understanding, confusion to knowing, and that we go from these determinate oscillations to these indeterminate spaces of indeterminate interiority, which is precisely where we want to go, but then it's relationally collapsed, so we feel that it's absent, we process it as lack, and then we instantiate a next round of drive. And that state of indeterminacy is precisely what allows us to access potentiality, what allows us to feel co-resonant with the indeterminacy of beauty, what also scares us and makes us feel the fear of what is awful as opposed to awesome, that which we cannot schematize and gives us trauma versus that which we cannot schematize and feels co-resonant. The fact that most of today's salient philosophers only talk about how to solve the meaning crisis, how to get back to a place of determinacy from this indeterminate confusion, that the place of indeterminate confusion is a bad place, a place that we should try and avoid. And so we should actually look to the institutions of the past. We should get back into a place of orientating religion. And that any state which is indeterminate and thereby confused and relationally collapsed, and which doesn't have a salience mapping that gives us any topological orientation, is a bad state, something to be avoided, and something that we must solve for, is precisely bad philosophy. Philosophy, in the way that you just described it, and in the way that freak theory lays it out, if philosophy is to be educational, is to educate about the meta-dialectical process, which always includes periods of indeterminacy. Because without those periods of indeterminacy, we have no potentiality. We have no transdeterminacy. We are in a purely deterministic world. We must go through the crucible of confusion to come out on the other side with change, with difference, with surprise, and so on. And so, coming back to the purpose of philosophy and the reason for the philosopher as a teacher is to teach the meta-dialectical process, which includes the swing from determinacy to indeterminacy, and how to deal with indeterminacy, not how to solve indeterminacy, but how to embrace indeterminacy, how to live through indeterminacy, how to relax in states of indeterminacy. And that can accelerate the process in a generative way, where we end up at a sublated version of capitalism, faster and with more embrace, and thereby with more calm and empathy for one another, and less war and less chaos, through the undifferentiated, embracing the undifferentiated, coming to terms with the real of undifferentiated as that which refuses language, as that which refuses schematization, and all of that being, of course, a spiritual process which allows us to live for moments in meditated states which accept the phenomenology of indeterminacy. And I think that that, in some ways, is the role of the philosopher, is to show us what life is, and that life is not about purely organizing the chaos. In fact, without equilibrium or moments of equilibrium, we wouldn't really have the states of disequilibrium that we consider to be differential life in the first place. We need to pass through the potentiality. We need to pass through the indeterminacy, embrace the indeterminacy as part and parcel of the dialectical life and the rhizomatic life, and so on, the world of difference. So yeah, it's been a great conversation, and I'm glad we ended on that note. And until next time, and congrats on the book release. I can't wait to read it.
Thank you, Alex. That was beautiful, and I really appreciate bringing attention, that the meaning crisis is actually a sign of hope. The very fact that we're having a crisis of meaning means that we've realized that meaning, as we've understood it, has reached a kind of saturation point where if we continue now, we're overfitting it. And really, we have to think about, I can give you meaning. Become a racist. Xenophobia, nationalism, these will give you meaning. Dugin is one great response to the meaning crisis. When you read his books or his talks he's basically looking over at the West and saying, well, I don't want anything to do with that because it creates a meaning crisis. And he references Gurdjieff and Spirit. And if we over in the West, which I know is a big phrase, but if we're just talking about the meaning crisis, Dugin looks right. He looks like he has a really good point if all we do is talk about the meaning crisis. But if instead we say no, we've actually entered into an opportunity to think according to a new phenomenology, to think according to freak theory, to think that indeterminacy is a blessing. This is a wonderful thing. In crisis, there's opportunity. And it's only a crisis if we don't rise to the occasion. And this is an opportunity to rise to the occasion. And the philosopher must speak that way. If we do not speak that way, then why in the world should Dugin not split from the West or try to avoid capitalism? Why in the world should people not be engaged in never leaving their apartment or never getting married to the future? All anyone hears is a meaning crisis out there. Well, then I'm not going out there. So we have to, as philosophers, say, yes, it's hard, but difficulty is precisely the opportunity for dynamicism. This is precisely the opportunity to encounter beauty that resonates, because only those who bleed have any chance of encountering beauty. But we have to be willing to bleed. And I think what you outlined was a beautiful articulation of that and quite inspiring. And I think that's an example of where the philosopher should be like the artist, in that they are able to inspire and to show one the way. In the dynamicism, in that, because belonging can be found no other way than in the dynamicism of longing and the dance of which is possible in there, not in avoiding it, but in identifying with it. But we need the right tools to do that. And those tools would be those such as freak theory. I use it all the time. It is invaluable. And a book like Belonging, again, cannot help but reference it every other page, because it is absolutely central for the possibility of leaving Plato's cave on our own, and the possibility of not ending up in a rat utopia. And you've done work that greatly contributes to that. And I'm grateful. Alex Ebert, always a pleasure, sir.
Thanks, Daniel. It's been great. Until next time.
Until next time. Cheers.